Hail fellow, well met. I see you've made your way to my video on Lord of the Rings. As you might be able to glean from the impressive length and dicey title, this is not something one endeavors without great love or hatred for a thing. I promise you, it is the former. It's easy to put these movies under the microscope, and you're usually rewarded for doing so. Pay close enough attention, and you'll see that there's even payoffs for drip-fed details from previous movies. Book enjoyers can also look for lines from the novel snuck in by different characters. And after having watched these films for pretty much all my life, I feel like I can point to the upper 90% of observable tidbits, but not all. Weird choice for a video then, but hear me out. This is the sort of artistic passion when you can't leave well enough alone. The kind your mind delves into when you've already exhausted all the trivia dialogue for everyone else in the room. Little known fact here, Viggo kicked that helmet so hard he chipped his tooth. I must say that with the current state of Hollywood, it's been a pleasure to look back on the movies from my youth. And that during these growing dystopian years, Lord of the Rings has been a series that's particularly helped me through a lot.
So do all who live to see such times, but that is not for them to decide. All you have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to you.
Despite predating them by some 50 years, Tolkien's literary works owe much gratitude to the Jackson films for cultural relevance within the 21st century. I would even bet that the overwhelming majority of audience introductions to Lord of the Rings these days is not the books, but instead the Jackson trilogy. Rest assured that, despite the title of this video, I personally maintain that these movies are indeed the greatest adaptations of the original novel on film. But the lesser essays in the craft are not to be dismissed. In fact, they are quite worth your time. A little dated at parts, but I'm just tickled that we got an animated version of every book. Well, almost. But yes, not only are the Jackson Lord of the Rings films the best adaptations of this story, I would go further to say that they are some of the greatest adaptations of all time, not always for accuracy or even internal consistency's sake, but for genuine effort, and a close enough preservation of the story's essence. A certain soul was preserved here, helped in parts by the score, the props, the acting, and the scale. Somehow Jackson managed to capture the comfiest feelings of home, and the epicness of other parts of Middle-earth all in the same movie, setting a bar that would sadly, but unsurprisingly, never be hit again. In general, I can't really stress enough how miraculous it is that each of these films was crafted with such passion and respect. Or how it's a wonder that all three films turned out so great. As is so often the case, a trilogy poops out a dud for its third installment, and usually the second film wasn't so great either. Unfortunately, that doesn't mean it would escape the franchise treatment, however. The Hobbit films were corporately slogged out, and I look back fondly to the days when Battle of the Five Armies was the worst Tolkien-related material out there, that I was aware of. Often, throughout this video, I will refer to both versions, as if there are only two tellings of the story. This is just for simplicity. There's a few adaptations, some that I've already mentioned, but probably a good 75% of normie discussion relating to Tolkien revolves around the movie, the novel, and their comparison. There are, in fact, other adaptations, some better known, and others seldom spoke of. If ever I am referring to one of these, I will clearly specify, just as I am doing with the Jackson films versus the novel and the extended source material, which I can imagine might be confusing enough. I also intend to skirt copyright with B-roll from various subjects. This will sometimes prevent me from playing any one clip in its entirety as I would have preferred. In that event, I will do my best to rely on cuts and fades, as well as other editing tricks to best get the job done. I love these films, and I'm not trying to tear them down. However, once I began to truly appreciate the books, I found it hard not to branch out to Tolkien's other work, and now I'm more than a little obsessed with the setting. There's a reason why people are still dissecting and discussing these books some 70 years later. The movies themselves have accomplished no small feat by provoking a similar treatment for 2 decades. But the caveat is that much of the credit is due to the writing, for which the larger bulk of the credit still goes to Tolkien. I'm happy to enter this larger discussion surrounding both works with my own critique of the films. Primarily because, barring a few exceptions, I find that criticism of the Jackson movies tends to be quite lacking in substance. But be aware that I'm no Tolkien scholar by any means. I haven't even finished all of my required reading. The point of this video is to heavily scrutinize the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings films from the early 2000s. Not to hate on them or complain unjustifiably, or to delve too deeply into anything that came later. During this critique, I will be offering substantive feedback, but only where I think it is needed, and within my own boundaries of articulation as well. I'm not saying I could have done a better job here overall. Instead, I think Tolkien could have. And for the most part, any errors or downgrades in the narrative from book to film could be improved with some finer consideration for his work. I do have the advantage of hindsight, however. A blessing wherein it is much easier to criticize the work of others than to create a thing itself. But what can you do? I don't think anyone seriously maintains that these movies are perfect, but if I'm wrong, you can go ahead and try. I put forth the case that if we are to be objective with such a failure to the proportions of Rings of Power Season 1, then we must keep that same objectivity for the mainstream discussion surrounding all Tolkien media, the good and the bad. And just to be clear, because I see the argument turn its head a lot, yes, this is a really horrible show. Even if you took everything to do with it being an adaptation away, it still fails even as generic fantasy, and furthermore as a standalone narrative. Its internal logic and consistency are frankly laughable. Believe me, if I can produce a video of this length covering my perceived faults with the Jackson trilogy and it not even be 100% comprehensive, wait until I cover Rings of Power. Someday. Back to the task at hand, however, and my list of grievances prepared for the movies. Throughout the course of this video, I will compare and contrast the trilogy with the novel it is based on, and occasionally make reference to other adaptations of Tolkien's work. The entirety of Tolkien's Legendarum is up for spoilers here. Be warned that I can, at any point, reference key plot points from the Lord of the Rings novel, the Silmarillion, the Hobbit, and all their related and derivative work. I sincerely love the books, so if you can't make the time to read them, then you can find them all in various audiobook formats. Barring any copyright claims, I've included in this section selections of clips read by Phil Dragish for the Lord of the Rings soundscape. It is, in my opinion, the greatest audiobook of the novel ever. It includes Howard Shore's soundtrack, and the soundscape itself is inspired by the Jackson trilogy. Phil even does impressions of every character himself, and his voice acting is spot on. Not only does he nail the tone of voice, he reads every character line with the cadence the actors had in the Jackson trilogy. And boy, does the man act his heart out for some of the dialogue. I know Andy Serkis's version is a bit more popular, and I wouldn't be honest without saying that the battle between the two was hard-fought in my mind. But I find it hard to separate Shore's compositions with the books. He did that good of a job. Even though there are alternatives, I still recommend Phil's, as it's my personal favorite. If you would like to give it a listen, and you have 36 hours, you can find the audiobook here on Spotify and the Internet Archive. Also, Rob Inglis does a great job too. If you prefer a drier telling of the story, and that's no complaint, then go with him. But to each their own between Phil and Andy's. Andy Serkis's narration is honestly stronger, and it's a no-brainer that certain renditions of his character voices are without compare.
Gollum was talking to himself. Smeagol was holding a debate with some other thought that used the same voice, but made it squeak and hiss. A pale light and a green light alternated in his eyes as he spoke.
Smeagol promised,
said the first thought.
Yes, yes, my precious,
came the answer.
We promised to save our precious, not to let him have it. Never. But it's going to him, yes. Nearer every step. What's the Hobbit going to do with it? We wonders, yes. We wonders.
I mean, just listen to that. He's got the real oomph to his storytelling. But I find Phil to be more well-rounded. I'll play a clip of his now. Well, no. Since Andy and Rob's are proprietary, I guess I'll have to do it myself. I suppose now is as good a time as any for introductions. Call me R.A.
Rapier Ape?
Yeah, and look at his name, Rapier Ape. He's obviously taken to a whole new level.
Oh my god, tell me there isn't a rapey-est ape. Oh my god.
Rapier Ape is retired, and he's called that because he wields a rapier.
He wields another...
No, a rapier. It's a sword used in fencing.
That is just sick. You but with a sword?
Oh man, that's gross. That is sick.
Gosh, I'd rather be the penis.
And you just may get your wish.
Wait.
I've already said that I'm a casual Tolkien enjoyer. This means that I have no responsibility to pronounce anything correctly. I'll try my best when I can be bothered to do so. But while editing this video, I noticed that I was particular about getting some names right, like Glowin, father of Gimli. But I also inconsistently pronounced Tolkien's own name, so what can you do? Also, you might already have picked up on the fact that I've been referring to The Lord of the Rings, authored by J.R.R. Tolkien, as a novel, a singular novel, or perhaps books. I'll be a little inconsistent on this as well, but for clarity, know that the spirit of what I mean is that The Lord of the Rings is a singular novel, comprised of 6 books, which were released in parts over the course of 1954 through 1955. The novel is not a trilogy, the movies are, though you can correctly refer to them with the collective term books. I will try to give context for the books when I can, summarizing the events for those who haven't read them, when I deem appropriate to do so, but I'm going to assume that you've seen the films I'm criticizing here. For visuals, I'll be using the Rankin Bass Hobbit and the Return of the King movies as well, plus the Ralph Bakshi film. These predate the Jackson film by about 20 years at the earliest, and will usually be used to represent parts of the book I'm explaining. I think they're swell. But make no mistake, I'm not saying that they're better than the Jackson films. Far from it, in fact. Though they may adapt things closer to the book at times, which kind of makes certain things easier to explain. If I'm ever directly talking about one of these movies, I'll make sure to let you know. You'll also hear me talk over certain Lord of the Rings related games as well. Further editor's note, this is going to cover exclusively the extended editions of the Jackson movies. I frankly don't find it worthwhile to point out the flaws in the theatrical versions. Also, if you ever see this symbol, it means that you should pause to read the text on screen, as I'll be covering some stuff pretty fast, and I'll sometimes be using on-screen text as reference. Well, that was a verbose preamble. I suppose it's about time for me to begin my analysis. Without further ado, let's get started. In The Fellowship of the Ring, we have a live-action version of the Knife in the Dark chapter from Book 1. Like many chapters, it is thoroughly abridged, though not first place by a long shot. Despite its trimmings, many of the key plot points are still preserved, and rightfully so, as this is one of the most important chapters in the entire novel. The party stops at Weathertop. 5 of the Nazgul attack, Frodo is stabbed by the Witch King, and then the Nazgul are driven off. These events shape Frodo's character, and his PTSD is preserved through both versions. Despite all of this, however, many of the moving parts here are changed between book and film. These factors are less noticeable in summary, but have a drastic impact on everyone involved. In the book, Aragorn leads the hobbits here.
This was the great watchtower of Amunsul.
In the hopes of meeting up with or receiving a sign from Gandalf. This is after they curiously but unknowingly perceived a battle between Gandalf and the Nazgul, represented by far-off lights surrounding the tower from miles away. Aragorn took this as a sign that he should journey there and investigate, for if they're to meet up with Gandalf, then they would likely be safe from the pursuing ringwraiths. After arriving there, Gandalf is not to be found, but they do find a rune left by him, though they had to guess this at the time. And it's here where Book Aragorn messes up. You see, he had taken Frodo and Merry with him up onto the tower, leaving Sam and Pip and the pony down below. This risk nets him Gandalf's rune, but it also makes him get spotted by dark figures some distance away, who they correctly believe to be ringwraiths. As soon as Aragorn sees them, he flattens and makes Merry and Frodo do likewise, and it's unclear at the time as to whether or not they've truly been seen. Aragorn curses his own carelessness and takes the hobbits down below, where they find firewood neatly gathered and left behind by rangers. These are fellow Dunedain of Aragorn's. something the extended versions only go into a little bit. After they find this, they set up camp in a ravine away from the tower. Figuring that they're already heading towards a confrontation, they reason that it'd be far better to have a fire than not. Remember that darkness won't hide you from Nazgul. Plus, they fear fire, to the point where the swordless Aragorn from the books is able to beat back 5 of the Wraiths, including the Witch King, with 2 on fire sticks. But this is after Frodo used the Prayer of Elbereth taught to him by Gildor. And, not to mention, all 4 hobbits are armed with barrow blades, which could hurt the Ringwraiths. Aragorn also doesn't fear the Ringwraiths, which is a massive source of power over their victims. The key takeaway after all that exposition is that Aragorn, even though he gets Frodo stabbed, at least recognizes the risk of traversing Weathertop. But it seems the chances of being spotted even during a brief visit were seemingly higher than he thought. But what does Viggo think when he spots him a big old watchtower, exposed on all sides by flat plains and being the only landmark for several kilometers?
We shall rest here tonight.
It's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off for him.
What follows is a masterful scene in building tension. We've traded some common sense from Aragorn for some impressive visuals and an unforgettable climax for the tertiary antagonists of the film. But this scene, more than most, suffers from the dreadful habits of current year's movie makers, which is to say that one must achieve a cool payoff by any means necessary. I'll continue to break this down, but I'd like to point out that by the end of this scene, the only character that makes it out unscathed writing-wise is Frodo. I just thought that was funny. Aragorn, being the leader of the group, and far and away the most experienced member, bears the primary blame for what befalls Frodo. And just to make it clear, after he's perched the hobbits on the highly visible landmark, he does this.
I'm going to have a look around.
Why? Why are you doing that, Aragorn? Do you think that Gandalf might have left some sign down under a random rock around the cliff face? Are you going to get food? Well, there's no need to do that, because in true Hobbit fashion, the boys are carrying bacon and sausage in their pockets. So why did he leave? Not to buy Longbottom leaf, because he comes back. I think the real answer is this. No, the real answer is that the filmmakers wanted their payoff with the hobbits alone with the Ringwraiths, and they couldn't come up with a good reason to get rid of Aragorn. Because frankly, there's not a good reason for Aragorn to leave the hobbits alone at this point, especially Frodo. Frodo is his sole charge. And after putting them in this precarious spot, he doesn't even counsel them on the danger they're in. The hobbits, with the exception of Frodo, have totally forgotten the Ringwraiths, carelessly starting a fire, making them visible from even further than they were previously. The hobbits deserve some blame for this, but the primary onus is still on Aragorn, who even after recognizing the danger by arming the hobbits, leaves to drop his kids off at Bywater anyway. Of course, this also begs the question as to where he got them, probably off-screen when Bill was seemingly bought. Bree does in fact have a hobbit population in the books. In the movies, it is entirely human men, whom we see dirtier and far less welcoming than their novel counterparts. An excuse could just be that we never see them, but this is odd given that the hobbits are supposed to feel uncomfortable with being in a completely foreign place. Little did they know there was more of their kind just off camera. But it is worth noting that Harry has a window to look eye level with hobbits through his door. So we know that hobbits are at least visitors to Bree.
We've got some nice, cozy, hobbit-sized rooms available.
We just don't see anything to do with hobbits and Bree beyond this point. In the books, Bree is a one-of-a-kind place where humans and hobbits coexist, and it's far more wholesome than in the movies. There are some untrustworthy characters, though, Harry at the Gate being one of them. Poor guy. He's not evil at all in the movies, and his fate is... Those slant-eye, swarthy men are also in the books, but they're foreigners, which Jackson might be a little hesitant to include for reasons. But don't let me get carried away. I can forgive the oddity of the swords. The larger issue at hand here is not even that Aragorn is gone, it's that he's so far gone he doesn't even notice the fire, nor have time to run back to Weathertop before Frodo gets stabbed. He apparently wasn't even looking in the direction of the tower for an extended length of time. Enough for at least 4 servings of
tomatoes, sausages, nice crispy bacon
to be cooked during that time. Yes, I understand the particulars of this point could be argued, but regardless, he shouldn't have left at all. Indeed, the ring race beat him there by minutes. It's also very convenient that things end up going the way that they do. None of the ring race opt to kill Sam, Mary, or Pip. But even if they had just been a little bit more efficient, they could have ended up with the ring anyway. It was within the king's grasp, after all. It's an odd choice made here by the Witch King as well. He chooses to coax Frodo into giving him the ring first, which, like the rest of the scene, is very cool, but then he stabs him with the Morgul knife in a non-vital area. He could have just killed Frodo here, and it sure is lucky he didn't.
You can see Frodo and Pippin being carried by Frodo's small gold ring.
Get the ring!
Yeah, type get
Kill
ring.
Frodo.
Oh my god, no!
I know I keep bullying Viggo's Aragorn here, but the more I scrutinize this scene, the more I realize everything is pretty much his fault. Either he approved of the fire on Weathertop, despite Frodo thinking it was a bad idea, or he was so oblivious, he was the only soul for leagues who didn't see it. The reason for this likely being that if he were to see it early, return back and correct them right away, and initiate combat with the Wraiths, we would have likely not only missed out on the tension phase of the scene and the cool imagery, but we as an audience would have likely realized Aragorn's mistake sooner, on top of it just being awkward.
Is that clear? Oh, quite clear, no problems. Right. Where are you going? We're coming with you.
The film places the blame for alerting the Wraiths squarely on the Hobbits, but really it was Aragorn's responsibility to keep them safe. This wouldn't be so bad if he were to not go and skirt all responsibility for his actions later. And this isn't going to be the last time I put down my complaints about it either, because Aragorn gets away with some pretty dodgy stuff.
Book comparison time.
I explained some of this earlier, but when Frodo gets stabbed in the book, it's after a blind rush from the ring wraiths uncloaked. They're performing a sneak attack, and the Witch King approaches Frodo with sword and dagger in hand. There's no temptation to give the ring to him like in the movie, just temptation to put it on, which makes Frodo revealed without any ambiguity to the Wraiths. Frodo doesn't have a rusty sword from Aragorn and is instead armed with a blade of Westernesse, as are the other three hobbits. This is a sword that can hurt the Witch King, and very nearly does when Frodo defends himself and takes off a scrap of his cloak. The more important action taken by Frodo at this moment, however, is the evocation of Elbereth. The Wraiths kind of have a vampire-like rule set applied to them in the books. The same goes for other creatures of evil, and a prayer to the likes of Elbereth sends them running, but not after he can get a desperate stab in. He uses the Morgul knife, which is the smarter of the two choices, as it not only has the chance to kill Frodo outright and trap his soul, the blade was meant to stab his heart, but misses, but even a non-fatal wound can eventually prove so. It curses him and eventually brings him under the king's control, if left unattended, and makes him fully visible to them even in the daylight. My only criticism, which is really more of a question, would be to ask why the Wraiths were not mounted during their attack. Doing so means they would probably kill everyone there. Not having full confidence in their numbers, it was a 5v5 after all, even if it was up against hobbits, they opt to try and sneak up on Frodo uncloaked, who has defenses they did not account for. I think that this answer is the weaker of the two alternatives, though. Instead, I think it could just be a smart decision by Aragorn. He specifically selects a ravine to set up camp at, and this terrain may have prevented mounted combat. Tolkien may have just seen fit to not be explicit about this, and it could have been super obvious to him, less obvious to a midwit like myself. Either way, the events of the book are laid out and any apparent weaknesses are seemingly covered, and that's something Tolkien's genius world-building accomplishes more often than you might think. The book, debatably, has everyone making the smartest decisions they can based on the information available to them at the time. Aragorn's choice to go to the pinnacle of Amon-Sul is the only decision that is somewhat suspect, but one could argue that, given the chances of ring wraiths watching at that exact moment, they were just pretty unlucky. Everyone behaved rather in line with their character regardless, though, and the same cannot be said for the film rendition of this scene, and that's a pretty big step down in terms of storytelling. I suppose a good middle ground might have been for Aragorn to take them to the top anyway, but not leave them and forbid any fires. Or, after making a point to show that the party is feeling a creeping dread following them all day, Viggo could go so far as to allow a fire, and then, as the Nazgul close in, he reveals that they were being tracked by them anyway, and that a conflict was inevitable, and that the terror they felt earlier in the day was their presence. You could then have very similar rising tension to what plays out in the movie, and keep the cool set piece that is Amon Sul. It's just that instead of the 4 hobbits alone, Aragorn is also with them. We're still operating mostly from Frodo's perspective, however, so we're feeling his terror as opposed to any confidence Aragorn's perspective might convey. You could even stress this by having Aragorn get locked in combat with 2 wraiths. As the 3 others close in on Frodo, you could even keep a similar series of events where the 3 hobbits try to protect him. I wouldn't have the king stop quite like this, though. I would have Frodo put on the ring from more of a distance, like he does in the book, and then give a shot of the Witch King from far away, followed by a close-up shot panning upwards to give the audience a good view of the Witch King's makeup. The Witch King would then perceive Frodo and rush him like he does in the books, but maybe Frodo deflects the blade aimed for his heart into his shoulder, and before the king can get in another strike, Aragorn is on him. Thankfully, this scene is probably my biggest grievance with the first movie. And for the record, I do think this is the strongest of the 3 films. To my assessment, it has the fewest issues and generally the most beneficial changes, as well as what might even be some improvements on the source material. Yes, there are some things that Jackson might have done better than Tolkien. Unfortunately, there's more than a couple characters of great importance that are a pretty big step down. While we're on the subject of Aragorn, let's talk about the differences in his character between book and film, outside of any particular scene. In the book, Aragorn is ready to become king by the time we meet him in Bree. He is at an age where he has accomplished much and is now in the prime of his life, fully prepared to come into his own and prove himself to the peoples of Middle-earth. The actualization of Aragorn's lineage is the culmination and catharsis not just of his lifetime, but also for some of the most important figures appearing within the lore. The entire universe has, in a way, been building up to Aragorn, and the universe itself nearly ends with him, as we don't get too much information regarding the Fourth Age. Aragorn has been told by Elrond, who's very much his adoptive father, that if he is to marry his true love in Arwen, or indeed take any wife at all, he must prove himself and toil beyond any other man of his era. Then he will be worthy, and he will be revealed to all as a true king of men. These great tasks of Aragorn, as well as the lack of any ambiguity surrounding who he is to become, is key. Because if these steps are not taken, and Aragorn simply walks into Gondor and declares himself king before Denethor, then he has not won the hearts of his people. The line of Isildur alone could be challenged, and pedigree by itself would not win him the high seat, especially when he has competition from seemingly greater men like Boromir and Faramir, whom the people love. In the films, however, Aragorn's doom to become king is treated less like fate and more like an inevitability.
This is no mere ranger. He is Aragorn, son of Arathorn. You owe him your allegiance.
Whoa there, Legolas. I know Aragorn is your friend and all, the movies, but you frankly don't have any right telling a man, much less the guy who's supposed to be the next steward of Gondor, who he owes his allegiance to. That's gonna be for the people of Gondor to decide for themselves. Fortunately, much like in the books, Aragorn does prove himself to Boromir, and their change dynamic is among one of the strongest alterations in the Jackson trilogy, as it adds a lot not only to Boromir's character, but also to this new proto-Aragorn. I really do like what they pull off here, but it's a double-edged sword. It is at this moment Aragorn pretty much reaches the point where he starts out at in the books, as far as character growth is concerned. Until now, Viggo's Aragorn is still, in a ways, immature. Being raised by elves, he has to get back in touch with his humanity, and Boromir, being the single most human element of the Fellowship, with all its faults and goodness, helps Aragorn accomplish this return to Earth.
People.
Careful there, boys, you're beginning to sound a little Eurocentric, but this new setup, while making for some fine additions, does introduce problems where there were none before. As I already said, I like this side of new Aragorn, but he is indeed a distinct character because of it. Book Aragorn is just better, though. I actually think that John Hurt comes about the closest to invoking him.
That ranger, Strider coming and going, and... Strider!
They come from Mordor. Save us.
They won't trouble you once I'm gone. Strider came to offer me his help.
Well, you know your own business, maybe. But in your place, I wouldn't take up with a ranger out of the wild.
They have no choice. There is no one else for them to take up with except a fat innkeeper who only remembers his name because people shouted at him all day. Because if I wanted the ring for myself, I could have it. Now. My name is Aragorn, son of Arathorn. If by life or death I can save you, I will.
Even if his version looks more like Redcorn than Aragorn. The first issue present is very much relating to Aragorn's claim to the throne. Aragorn on his own is simply a reluctant hero, learned from history and cautious to accept power. But if his pedigree alone is so strong a claim, then what's stopping Arathorn or any of his other predecessors? In the books, this is a complicated web to answer, but some of it is explained in part by my previous remarks. But in the movie, the line of succession seems to be all that matters here. And yet, it is constantly sullied. Something to mention is that the film's depiction of Isildur differs quite a bit from the books. Well, that's no shock at all. But while you might expect me to say that the book treats Isildur with much more respect while the movie depicts him as an idiot, it's actually not quite as simple as that. The Isildur that we get on screen actually rises to the occasion a bit higher than his book counterpart. And frankly, he doesn't do anything wrong that we can't cast stones for ourselves. Well, then it's odd how Lord of the Rings fans, exclusively of the moviegoer variety, might come away with a rather poor opinion of Isildur then. But why wouldn't they? His desire for power is the original sin which has now come to claim the West. But the difference here is Isildur's posthumous reception. In the book, characters generally speak with reverence and caution regarding Isildur. Elrond is, of course, the authority on lore regarding him, and while he doesn't mince words about Isildur's mistake in taking the ring, he still sees him as a former comrade and brother in arms, someone who was willing to stand with him against Sauron, side by side. But nevertheless, he took the ring, despite Círdan and Elrond telling him not to. And the irony of what might be the last member of the faithful shirking the advice of two of the wisest elves in all of history is not lost on me. Still, Isildur might have been needed in a way. Nothing is known about the ring save that it came from Sauron, but at that time nobody knew that its continued existence would also keep Sauron alive. Besides, the ring was just kind of there. It's a pity Isildur took it and not Elrond or Círdan, but it did have to be taken by somebody. The implication by Tolkien here is that after Sauron's body form was slain by Elendil and Gil-galad, Isildur, desiring the ring, cut it from Sauron's unconscious body. This pretty much left Sauron temporarily dead, but so long as the ring lingered, he returned. I should inject here that the taking of the ring is pretty much singularly Isildur's right, as elucidated by Frodo, both in front of Faramir and at the council without objection, when he states that if a claim to the ring were to exist, then it would be Aragorn's to make.
Then it belongs to you, and not to me at all.
Bring out the ring, Frodo.
The thing is, though, we don't actually even know if throwing the ring into the fire is even possible, which may be part of the reason why Book Elrond is not so quick to judge. What does movie Isildur do, though? Well, he gets the kill shot on Sauron this time, literally saving everyone, and then he actually makes an effort to take the thing up the slopes of Mount Doom. Yes, this iconic scene is, in fact, a movie fabrication. With this in mind, you would think that his reception would be even better in the films. But
Isildur kept the ring. The line of kings is broken. There's no strength left in the world of men.
Listen, I can't be the only person that thinks that these two statements don't jive.
This peril belongs to all Middle-earth. They must decide now how to end it. The dwarves? They hide in their mountains seeking riches. They care nothing for the troubles of others. Men are weak. The race of men is failing. This peril belongs to all Middle-earth. They must decide now how to end it.
Behind closed doors, Elrond appears to be a doomer with no hope in men. We will not forget this little tidbit, but keep in mind this is in spite of what Elrond witnessed at the end of the Second Age. Another juxtaposition is Elrond's strange newfound ambition, particularly regarding the plan he drafted ahead of the council and which he has abstained himself from. On top of that, he's playing a game of Kingmaker if I've ever seen one, and he's moving some awfully big pieces on the board. In the books, Elrond calls this exact meeting because so many people of importance just happen to show up. With more than a little divine intervention, I might add. When the question of what to do with the ring then naturally arises, it is deemed best for these representatives of the peoples of Middle-earth to decide its fate. Movie Elrond, however, is setting in motion a plan he apparently drafted either at the forewarning of Gandalf or at the arrival of Bilbo. Yet the film's quick and ambiguous timeline makes me question the logistics of the summoning, journey, and arrival of all these important figures. Gandalf very likely did not detour to Rivendell first before going to Frodo. And from there, it seems he went straight to Isengard. He was then trapped and taken by Gwaihir, but all this happened after Frodo set out. I just don't see everyone making it here in time. Boromir would have 90% of the journey to Mount Doom to go, in the time it takes Aragorn and the Hobbits to journey to Rivendell, though we can also throw Frodo's recovery time in there too. So I think it makes more sense for Elrond to come up with this at Bilbo's earlier arrival, supposing that it was indeed earlier. But man, talk about some rapid degeneration. Bilbo appears to have aged this much in only a couple months. Yet, he goes on to kick around for nearly 4 years afterwards. This whole situation is further complicated by the fact that word of the ring seemingly reaches Denethor before this, and he does not have a Palantir, so did Elrond seriously let it slip? Our time frame, something Tolkien himself cared very deeply for and paid a lot of attention to, is for a moment mistaken for something D&D wrote here. We have something messy on our hands, merely obscured to the viewer because of the pacing and action built up until this point, where frankly people couldn't help but notice Gendry hightailing it through time. So, movie Elrond just has the ability to summon world leaders. Granted, some had incentive, but let's hope that the beans weren't spilled everywhere in Middle-earth because of OPSEC like this.
A dream. I saw the eastern sky grow dark.
These guys are obviously men, and they're positioned with Boromir at the council. Almost like they're part of his entourage or something, but we know that this is not the case because not only does Boromir get here alone, but no word of the mission is brought back to Gondor. We're obviously just meant to forget that these guys are even here. They're obviously just there to fill out the ranks. Like Figwit, hey, there's even some more men across the way. Why? Just use more elves. This is completely nonsensical given Elrond's positions. Inviting this many people to the council in general puts everything at risk too. We are forgoing all chances of secrecy here. It would make sense for important elves who are currently at Rivendell to be attending the council. We don't need to make these guys human. All we're doing here is letting the enemy know that something big is going down. For all we know, the enemy could have caught wind of what was going on because of Elrond's many invitations. It's apparent to me that Elrond's motives do not jive with his actions in the least. While Hugo's performance is very strong, this character in particular has suffered a massive downgrade in terms of writing. Even though his qualities by and large stay the same, he retains almost none of his personality traits from the book. Book Elrond is kind and approachable, and this is in spite of him having every reason not to be. But the fact that he still is, after everything that he's been through, speaks to his character and why he is a ring bearer. Why does he have every reason to be pessimistic, you ask? To name a few, he was orphaned by war at a young age. He never got to see his true parents again, and his adoptive father figures later died horribly. His twin brother chose to become mortal and die, which permanently sunders their souls from seeing each other until maybe after the apocalypse is over with, and that's still a big if. His beloved king and comrade of a long-time war campaign died horribly before his very eyes and at the hands of the very same Dark Lord who has risen again. And his wife, daughter of Galadriel, had to leave Middle-earth because her spirit got broken by a bunch of orcs. But in spite of all this, and even though he's comparable to Galadriel in terms of power and grace, on top of being an authority on lore and medicine even amongst the wise, yeah, Gandalf is legit deferring to this guy, Elrond still maintains himself as someone who the hobbits can just pal around with. He's just got that vibe, dude. One of the most apparent things with the guy is his generosity and kindness. Movie Elrond, though, spends the majority of his time decidedly unhappy. He's one of the more pessimistic characters despite spouting off with some of the biggest hopes and ambitions, often used by the movies to break down the heavier-hitting topics. This, in isolation, isn't bad, but there's some sloppiness. Elrond cares for his daughter and will go to some rather devious lengths to keep her on board, with him in a literal sense, but allows for her to go ranging with the knight abroad and says nothing about the matter upon her return. Elrond thinks men are weak, but sends two on his epic quest, one of whom made a pretty good show as to why he shouldn't go. Elrond desires secrecy for his quest, but sends invitations all across Middle-earth, and allows word of it to spread across the land as well. Elrond, despite expressing no faith in the people of Middle-earth's Second Age, is getting ready to thrust a quest upon them that, honestly, he should just consider doing himself at this point. I mean, why not? He's been there. And if he gets there and discovers that he can't pitch the thing in, then guess what? He's got no room to criticize, ya boy. Okay, let's get back on track here. The fact that the movie's lowered false moral high ground over Isildur, in spite of the protagonist following in his footsteps. I think a misunderstanding of original sin on the writer's part is the main reason why Elrond is so judgmental here. Even somebody like Frodo had the necessary foreknowledge to deal with the ring, and even he didn't do it right in the end. Gollum had to be there to force a situation in which the ring got destroyed. I could forgive it if it was just Elrond acting this way, but the films themselves just want to depict Isildur as a turd, like him failing this impossible task proves how bad men are. And this should really affect things when so much importance is placed on Aragorn's lineage. When you're saying that being his heir is all that matters, then it's important to not drag his name through the mud.
Why do you fear the past? You are Isildur's heir, not Isildur himself.
The lines aped here are actually taken from the book in part, though in the book they're delivered at the Council of Elrond, from Aragorn to Boromir, under completely different context and connotation. Here, Aragorn is explaining that, while he may fail to look like a king of old, he'll be able to prove himself to Boromir if given time. The decay of humanity from a golden age is an apparent theme here. Whereas in the movie, Arwen is telling Aragorn, who seems ashamed of his ancestry, that he's in fact better than Isildur. A dreadfully contemporary take, yes. Certainly we will succeed and make right where our predecessors did wrong. It's all too common to see characters in media gloating over misplaced virtue. And this in particular was a mistake that Tolkien was very careful not to make, at the risk of his own work aging poorly. Never did I think I'd be able to draw a comparison between Tolkien's work and a satirical scene from American Psycho, but here we are. Something Tolkien loathed allegory. So, yeah. I think it's inarguable that the West is in an age of decline, but let's get back to the fictional Middle-earth here. It's true that the Return of the King will usher in a new era, but we can't force blame and say that Aragorn is better than Isildur, when the ring was never a burden he had to bear. Yes, Aragorn refuses the ring, and I think that that's the strongest argument in the film's camp here. But in Isildur's defense, the ring was thrust upon him, when there was no one else to take it, at least in the movie. And whether or not it's possible to intentionally cast the ring into the fire remains uncertain. The ring is said to even, in a way, have dominion over its own master. It especially doesn't help that, despite the example of Isildur and the, for some reason, unique qualities of movie Frodo, that the film seemed to show no awareness that Frodo failed in just the same way that he did. That's enough talk about Isildur now. Let's focus on the other parts of Aragorn's lineage. Elendil, first king to sit in the high seat of Gondor, and the battle cry of Aragorn. Truly an unforgettable person in the lore. The whole prologue, while effective, doesn't seem to share the same respect for Aragorn's ancestry as the rest of Middle-earth does. Elendil is hardly spoken of in the movies, so this brief scene is pretty much all we get for him. Now, in just a few seconds, we could have been shown an awesome king locked in battle with Sauron, holding his own yet being ultimately defeated by the terror from the Dark Tower. This wouldn't take away from Elendil so much, and Sauron would still be the same domineering force here as he was in the original prologue. This still wouldn't make Elendil live up to his legendary status in the movies, but it would give credit where credit is due. The victory of men and elves over Sauron was less that of Isildur, who dealt the final blow, and far more to that of Elendil and Gil-galad, last High King of the Noldor. I don't want to go into too much detail surrounding Elendil. Much of what I would have to say is said better in this video by the traditionalist Tolkienist. He breaks down much of the material surrounding Elendil superbly. But if we want to talk about Gil-galad's depiction, then there, that's all the films have to tell you, but don't worry, Rings of Power makes up for it by slandering him as an underhanded politician, and I'll stop there. Obviously, there's no time to fit an entire appendices worth of backstory in for these characters. Heck, they can't even get it right spending $1 billion on one show. But I'm not asking anyone to fit an entire book into a single prologue. That's not what I'm arguing for, and I understand the film constraints. What I'm asking for is possibly a few seconds more to portray these legendary figures who hold up the world as part of its lore with the reverence that not only they deserve, but what Aragorn deserves as well. Aragorn, while certainly kingly in some ways thanks to Viggo's performance, is shortchanged by proxy here. The point of the story is to create legends for modern England. You can't do that if you don't have legendary figures in your mythos. They are, at the very least, present. They're getting a participation trophy for fluffing out the lore, but so far, Arries in the Snyder Cut alone has left a better impact than Elendil. I will destroy you! The characters who appear in the prologue are just not awesome enough to justify the feats that they're pulling off. The Elfie boys put up a good show, but the Númenóreans, even the full-blooded ones, seem no different than regular men. And I get the argument. They wanted the situation to seem dire and everything, with Sauron looming over, just about to grasp victory, and to really give you a sense of how powerful he was. But to take him out in such a way by so mundane of heroes actually shows the opposite. After everything he just did, that's all we have to do to defeat him. This actually would have been a great opportunity for Jackson to go kinda crazy like he does with his later movies. I mean, a lot of the characters in the Silmarillion are walking around with anime power levels. An epic struggle could have been depicted for a few seconds with the rest left up to our imagination. A big ask, sure, but these are some big shoes to fill, and the point of the prologues is to show these days that have gone by. The epic scale of ancient times has wound down. Aragorn himself would go on to perform many amazing acts of valor, should at best rival his predecessors, not exceed them. At the very least, we get some tribute shown when Aragorn sings a part of Elendil's oath at his coronation. But this is far from the most grievous complaint I have about Elendil's treatment by adaptations in general. So let's move on to something else. The Two Towers is probably the movie I hear the most praise for personally. I can understand why. It introduces much of the rest of the cast of the trilogy and contains some of the most compelling battles on film. And it's gonna have one of the most iconic openings ever. So much so that I'm shocked that it hasn't been copied more. Like the rest of the trilogy, it follows the events of the book closely enough. But for the build-up to the climax, we have some conflict for characters that just feels artificial. I wish I could think of a better descriptor, but that's really it. The film just introduces problems and strife among the main characters. Some of it is pulled off kind of well, I think. But Legolas's moment of despair is just a memorable drop in the bucket.
War, yes. It affects us all. This is not our war.
The Ents are made quite incompetent with their decision from the moot, especially since they decide not to partake in the war without really explaining why. After much deliberation, they resolutely decide to fight in the books. But I think I see where Jackson saw a problem. They do it without the direct input, per se, of Merry and Pippin. And while we get some good scenes as a result of what Jackson did, I mean, the last March of the Ents gives pretty much everyone chills, I think, but it still makes the Ents, and Treebeard in particular, far less intelligent. In fact, they are quite dumbed down overall, and much of the somber, poetic traits of Treebeard and Quickbeam are absent from the film entirely, at least in any effective way. I mean, Treebeard just lets acres of his forest get chopped down without even noticing. Somehow, though, Pippin has a hunch of how it will look over there. I'm unsure how I would improve this scene. Maybe have Treebeard be on the side of Merry and Pippin after the moot, but he caves to the other Ents. But that would introduce its own problems. I probably just wouldn't change it from the books, where it was Merry and Pip's hastiness that rubbed off on Treebeard and spurred him into action. Yes, the hastiness is a quality that's use extends beyond that of just a catchphrase.
Oh, it's nice here. The forest looks so different in the sunlight.
I know. It's funny, but well, I almost feel I like the place.
Almost felt you liked the forest. That's uncommonly kind of you.
Merry and Pip have a rather strange effect on Treebeard, and his knee-jerk reaction upon seeing them is just to step on them. But after he listens to what they have to say, he decides to take them under his wing. Merry and Pip are the change that was needed, just at the right time in Fangorn Forest. Fate offering a guiding hand once again. But Treebeard is a far smaller matter than what my real problem with the movie plot is here. The fact that the Fellowship constantly seeks to undermine Theoden. I'm gonna shout out TT again because he's already got a great video on this. So I will try to give a high-level overview and go into detail into the areas I feel that I can really contribute at. Let's start where Theoden returns to being himself again. After Theoden is freed from Saruman's grip, he is about to kill Grima, but Aragorn stops him. Now, Theoden is king and all, so he still could carry out the execution, and he would be right to do so. But he relents and lets Grima go after he cools down. A similar series of events occurs in the books, but instead, Éomer is here, and it is he who is about to kill Grima, after he finds out about his end goal to marry Éowyn. Gandalf, an otherworldly powerful figure and servant to the living embodiment of mercy, stops Éomer instead, because Grima's already done all the harm he can do to Rohan. This rings true, as Wormtongue does not make it to Isengard until after the battle, and after the tower itself has already been taken by the Ents. Besides, it's Éomer who is about to strike, not Theoden, and Éomer's righteous anger is not yet law until he becomes king. Gandalf instead opts to spare Éomer a guilty conscience and tells him not to kill out of anger. The test is instead put before Grima, and he's allowed to take any horse that might bear him and show his true colors. He may come to serve Theoden, truly yet again, as he did before, or he can crawl back to Saruman. But before he goes, Theoden warns him that should he choose the latter, he will show him no quarter when they next meet. Theoden would have been right to kill him, but ultimately we chose the highest ground possible, in true Tolkien fashion, with every part played by the most appropriate actor. The movie, however, has Aragorn physically stop Theoden here. Aragorn doesn't have the right to do this. He's not yet taken a seat in Minas Tirith, yet he directly undermines the leader of a people who is about to dole out justice to a man who has been committing treason for who knows how long, for a foe who seeks to genocide Rohan. The big problem here, though, is that not only is there no test of loyalty, I mean, honestly, the spit tells you all you need, but there's also the fact that Grima is set loose at a time when he can still do damage. Throw him in chains instead. I mean, the guy immediately flies back to Saruman and sells you all out. Obviously, Saruman was plotting something already, as he had the black powder prepared, but Grima not only lays out that Theoden and his people will flee to Helm's Deep, he also describes the weak points in the walls, allowing Saruman's forces to obliterate the defense at Helm's Deep. It could be possible that Saruman was saving the powder for the gate, or he was considering using the bombs as missiles or something. but he obviously finds Grima's contribution worthwhile. It's a bit more mysterious how Saruman pulls this off in the books, but here we have a plain explanation, and Wormtongue is featured as a prominent actor therein. This blood is on his hands. Still, even if Saruman could have devised this entirely on his own accord, as he did in the books, what is solely Wormtongue's idea is the attack on women and children as they flee to Helm's Deep. Wormtongue is far less human here than the sniveling politician we see in the books. He's a monster, and he deserved none of the mercy he was shown.
It will be slow. They will have women and children with them.
It was an error in judgment by the character of Theoden, who may be excused for not thinking clearly, but I cannot emphasize enough how Aragorn had no right or authority to pardon Grima's punishment. Hama's death, and all of the deaths of the soldiers loyal to Theoden, even in his failing years, are primarily on the shoulders of Aragorn. The films recognize none of this. I have seen people defend this act of mercy by stating that Grima kills Saruman. But the fact is that they needed Saruman's information, and this was literally the worst possible time to kill Grima. There was in fact no more harm he could have done, but we need to ferry him out of the story, so... After Grima leaves Meduseld, the Fellowship goes on to chide Theoden's every decision, second-guessing him and handing out worthless advice for the rest of the film. They immediately advise that Theoden should declare war and meet Saruman's forces in an open field. But it's stated later that Theoden only has a few hundred men at his disposal. They have 300 prior to the fight at Helm's Deep, and this is after they've suffered heavy casualties to the Warg Riders, a small force that was just a spur-of-the-moment decision by Isengard. They would be wiped out in a single battle. They would not survive any extended series of engagement, and the world at large really doesn't have time for any of this.
Look to the black ships.
Like in the books, Theoden recognizes that they need to force a decisive battle from an area that would actually give them a major advantage. Now, Aragorn does correctly point out that Éomer's forces, who in the movies contain the overwhelming majority of Rohan's fighting men, all of whom just cartoonishly decided to leave their families and go errant riding in exile across the countryside, would indeed return and fight. But Theoden is realistic in how long it would take for word to be sent to them and then for them to return.
Éomer cannot help us.
It is only Gandalf on Shadowfax that can make the journey in time, but this is seemingly kept from Theoden in the film. So, what does the gang think of the whole battle strategy?
Helm's Deep. They flee to the mountains when they should stand and fight.
The fact that a dwarf hears about a defense via mountain fortress and thinks it a stupid idea is baffling.
There is no way out of that ravine. Theoden is walking into a trap and thinks he's leading them to safety.
What they will get is a massacre.
These lines, more than any other almost, are what made me choose the word artificial to describe this conflict. Not only is this the singular thing Theoden can do to keep his people alive right now, it also strategically traps the Isengard forces on accident. When Éomer's forces close in, they only have the forest to flee to, which slaughters them. The divine and far-sighted Gandalf the White should actually be the last person to doubt Theoden's plan here. And his foresight for the battle, prophesied immediately after this, contradicts his words here, of course. And just to make it clear, the heroes take no such uncertain position about Theoden's plan in the books. But the writers felt we needed a little conflict inserted here. The refuge of Helm's Deep provides conventionally unbreachable walls. It bottlenecks the enemy forces, and requires them to make a steep mountain climb prior to the battle. And it works, until Saruman's fireworks go off. In a scene I don't really understand the drama for, because even if that guy went down, someone else could just pick it back up. But if cracking under pressure is his only flaw, then Legolas largely makes it out of the trilogy unscathed. Just to make it clear, I won't go picking apart the battle sequences, for the most part. They are grand, but I think the stratagem here is better left in the hands of the more knowledgeable YouTubers out there. For now. I mean, there's really no reason to wait to shoot them.
Give them a volley.
Except I will point out one flaw in Theoden's plan. You don't need to be doing volleys here, just fire at will. In this scenario, you don't even have to aim to hit anything. Prior to the fight, Aragorn and Gimli both proved to be complete drags on morale, loudly, right in Theoden's face in front of all of his men manning the walls.
This is no rabble of mindless orcs. These are Uruk-hai. Their armor is thick and their shields broad.
Okay, thanks, Gimli, that's very helpful. Is Theoden somehow not treating this seriously enough for you?
They do not come to destroy Rohan's crops or villages. They come to destroy his people. Down to the last child.
What does pointing this out help with, Aragorn? Theoden is obviously making a last stand if need be. And what is Aragorn's proposed solution?
Gondor will answer.
No, they won't, Aragorn. You don't know what you're talking about. Book Denethor may have seen the strategic advantage in saving Rohan, but movie Denethor is another matter. He will not help you, nor will anyone else. And at this point, it's just a matter of feasibility. The Rohirrim arrive at Minas Tirith quickly enough, but they're on horseback. Gondor has far fewer horsemen. Their primary force would march on foot, and they would be marching for weeks. Plus, it would leave Gondor terribly exposed. Gandalf on Shadowfax may ride to Minas Tirith in 3 days, but they're not only both tireless, Shadowfax is the fastest horse alive. A conventional runner would need a week to get there, as he would be burdened with the need to sleep and rest, and he would have a slower horse. We're probably looking at around a month for help that would never come, and a proper siege that might last a month is bypassed anyway by the explosives that breach the wall. And like I said, Gondor would then be severely undermanned by the time they are attacked by Mordor. Theoden is supposed to come off as some hopeless dotard here, but he's completely right. And he's been the single most correct character at every turn. And that title should go to none other than Gandalf, and does at this point in the books, but dang, we've weakened nearly half the Fellowship with one fell arc here, by reducing them to morons with these suggestions. Had their advice been followed, Rohan would have fallen rather quickly, and by extension the West would have fallen, and all would be lost. I'm not even mad at Theoden for despairing, he's done everything right here. And it's not like he's the first to do so. Plus, he's only breaking down when he's literally at his wit's end. Theoden, my guy. At least your speech will go down as the best in the series. I've been dogging these films pretty hard, so why don't I credit one change for a change? I really like the scene depicting Theoden's down at 0 hour. He's given a rhyme that Aragorn speaks upon reaching Edoras in the books. But the change is appropriate, and frankly, I prefer this to the books. As much as I have the capacity to blow a gasket when I think about the particulars of this act of the film, I still love it. Yes, some of the mechanics may be borked, but it achieves a great deal. I don't want to get started on the elves. Haldir shouldn't die here, because he's not even supposed to be here. Nor should any of the other elves, and their deed is quite thankless when you think about it. But I have to say I'm pretty grateful to Peter Jackson for cutting out Arwen. It was a simpler time, back when writers listened to fans and didn't actively shun them.
In the original shooting of this scene, there was actually mention made of Arwen, and that she was waiting for Aragorn. When Arwen was removed from the Helm's Deep storyline, we were able to just remove the mentions of her from that scene.
Originally, there was a thought that Arwen would be a warrior and that she would come with the elves and fight alongside of the elves and Aragorn defending Helm's Deep. This whole sequence here where Aragorn's running up to now rescue Haldir. Actually, originally he was running up to assist and rescue Arwen.
Unfortunately, they couldn't cut out the rest of the elves, though. So I can't really beat around the bush. This accomplishment by the Men of the West is made less, objectively, by their inclusion. They would have never have pulled this off without the elf sacrifice. Guess you can't call that the last alliance anymore, can you? There are many characters within the Jackson films who, while great, fail to live up to the standards set by their book counterparts. And really, that's no surprise. Tolkien himself acknowledged that an adaptation would have a difficult time, and there would be a need to make compromises in a lot of areas. Naturally, in a character-driven novel, these compromises would extend to that of the characters. Yes, I said character-driven over something like world-driven, because it very much is the characters that are driving and shaping the course for Arda itself. And while descriptions and histories of the setting in various locations are abundant, they're outdone by just how much is going on between the various plot lines and arcs of each character, even the seemingly minor ones. To go one further, and you'll rarely hear anyone else say this, Tolkien's work in prose and in character descriptions is concise. I actually think he's rather efficient with his language, especially in regard to just how much information he conveys with it. I'm sure examples exist to prove me wrong, but I'd show some counterexamples of my own in turn. Critics want to act like Tolkien is redundant with his writing, and frankly, I will not accept this as anything more than a skill issue. Tolkien's writing isn't perfect, but it is timeless beyond this particular criticism. With all that said, I think that going into every little detail about every downgrade and missed opportunity with all the characters between book and film is a bit beyond the scope of this analysis. I think it's fine to highlight weaknesses of a character while discussing other larger moving parts of the story. I did it earlier with Aragorn and Elrond, and I'll do it more with them and various others, but only when it's of particularly great importance. Not to say that choosing to largely ignore a character's misuse, like that of Pippin's, is not important. It's just a matter of substance in my mind, and frankly, whether or not it's just worth the argument. Besides, I don't want to whinge.
Oh, Pippin is so great in the books, and he's such an idiot in the movies. He uses Frodo's name, and he steals from Farmer Maggot. Oh!
It's my conclusion that the characters as they appear in the novel are by and large stronger than their movie depictions. So, with some detours, I want to keep my criticisms of the characters by and large limited to the really important ones. Ones that I think there's some worthwhile discussion surrounding, and exploring just why the film is hurt by their comparatively lesser portrayal. Let's articulate why that is and what ingredients are missing. Speaking with anecdotes here, I see criticism for this particular character pop up quite a bit. I'm going to rebut this criticism where I think it's unjustified and theorize on why some viewers may feel this way in a general sense, as this especially seems to be a position some people take after consuming both book and film. Gimli the Dwarf is awesomely portrayed on screen by John Rhys-Davies and Brett Beatty. Gimli is very often used to lighten the mood with some humor. His displays of valor and accomplishments on the battlefield also speak for themselves. And his friendship with Legolas is probably one of the most memorable character dynamics in the Legendarum, next to Frodo and Sam, and with some competition for Merry and Pip, of course. As great as he is, however, many felt let down by his portrayal, and I think I can see why. It's important to stress here that even if a great character is turned out on film, he may still not live up to his canonical namesake. Book Gimli be some big shoes to fill. One of the foremost complaints about movie Gimli is the reduction of his character to that of comic relief. And there is legitimacy here. As the films progress, Gimli becomes something of a punchline more and more. I would actually keep most of the jokes though, as I do think they tend to be in good taste generally.
Shall I describe it to you? Or would you like me to find you a box?
But some I could do without.
What do trees have to talk about, Except the consistency of squirrel droppings.
As they're not just insulting to Gimli, but they also undercut the scenes that they appear in. But others I would just edit a bit.
Oh no, a drunk dwarf. How out of character.
I know, right?
Yeah, Gimli being drunk here is all well and good, but it's Legolas's resistance to the beer that poses more of a problem, as his countrymen shared no resistance to wine earlier in The Hobbit. Bit of retroactive contradiction there. Many of Gimli's jokes are a little too lowbrow, and while I can get over this for the most part, I think it really bothers Tolkien as he watches on high. It's hard to be certain, but Gimli might have been his favorite character. And because of the Jackson films, audiences have been gaslit on who he really is. Gimli is not just a dwarf, he's the dwarf. And we know that Jackson would later go on to make some pretty heavy-handed attempts at reverence towards characters like Thorin Oakenshield. And this attempt at sincerity is all really funny to me, in this complex, meta, retrospective sense. Going back to Jackson's Gimli, though, we have a character who is unsurprisingly simplified through his movie appearance. Yeah, no small wonder, but what's tragic is just how he was made simpler. We decided to emphasize Gimli's funny moments, his cool moments, but we lost a bit of his soul. As a rule, Tolkien's humor was always pretty classy. I can't actually think of a time that he made a joke in his literature that wasn't respectable. Gimli, likewise, is used to lighten the mood in the books, but he's never the butt of any joke. More often than not, he's being pretty relatable, which, given the novel's age, is pretty impressive. I think one of the biggest blunders are the omission of Gimli's finer moments. Yes, they got his friendship with Legolas right, but not his friendship with Éomer. And his interaction with Galadriel is, in my opinion, one of the more greatly diminished aspects of the Jackson films. Yes, the scene with him and Galadriel together is present, but the change that this is supposed to bring about is not very evident, beyond just, what the heck, I like elves now. Now, the death of Gandalf certainly has an impact on Gimli's character, but it's his relationship with Galadriel that actually establishes his friendship with Legolas. The movie does include some of Gimli's more eloquent language from the novel, but this comes after the fact and we cut away from the scene where we could have seen them interact more. In fact, by cutting away, and then having Gimli never mention Galadriel again, we kind of squander her words with him in Caras Galadhon. But what do the two of them say?
And what gift would a dwarf ask of the elves?
Nothing. Except to look upon the lady of the Galadrim one last time. For she is more fair than all the jewels beneath the earth. Actually, there was one thing. No, I'm talking nonsense. It's quite impossible. Stupid.
Not bad, and a lot is left to the imagination off screen. But when I read the book version again, I was shocked by the contrast here. He's certainly hit with some star power, but he doesn't quite lose his composure like that. Instead, the scene goes a little something like this. "And what gift would a dwarf ask of the elves?" said Galadriel, turning to Gimli. "None, lady," answered Gimli. "It is enough for me to have seen the lady of the Galadrim, and to have heard her gentle words." "Hear, all ye elves," she cried to those about her. "Let none say again that dwarves are grasping and ungracious. Yet surely, Gimli, son of Glóin, you desire something that I could give. Name it, I bid you. You shall not be the only guest without a gift." "There's nothing, Lady Galadriel," said Gimli, bowing low and stammering. "Nothing, unless it might be, unless it is permitted to ask, nay, to name a single strand of your hair, which surpasses the gold of the earth as the stars surpass the gems of the mine. I do not ask for such a gift, but you commanded me to name my desire." The elves stirred and murmured with astonishment, and Celeborn gazed at the dwarf in wonder. But the lady smiled. "It is said that the skill of the dwarves is in their hands rather than in their tongues," she said. "Yet that is not true of Gimli, for none have ever made to me a request so bold and yet so courteous. And how shall I refuse, since I commanded him to speak? But tell me, what would you do with such a gift?" "Treasure it, lady," he answered, "in memory of your words to me at our first meeting. And if ever I return to the smithies of my home, it shall be set in imperishable crystal, to be an heirloom of my house, and a pledge of goodwill between the mountain and the wood until the end of days." Broke out around a technicality. My man Gimli rather coolly wordsmiths Galadriel into giving him a lock of her hair, all in front of Celeborn no less. Though Jackson would make up for it, and remember to make him a
Sigma male
retroactively in The Hobbit. Let's ignore Halbrand too while we're at it. He's not real. The whole show was just a bad dream. Galadriel is terribly important to Gimli, Legolas, and Aragorn, and is frequently recalled by the trio in the books. And while her impact does live on in being a factor of change in him and Lego's bond, only Frodo ever recalls her later on in the story. Gimli fails to recall her directly ever again, missing out on his further moments of poetry. Moreover, without the emphasis of Galadriel's gift to Gimli and his frequent recollection of her, we are stripped of one of the more pleasant and unexpected friendships from the book. When Éomer encounters the three hunters in the movie version of the Two Towers, probably the most memorable part of the scene, apart from his sword falling out of its scabbard, blink and you'll miss it, would be the brief altercation involving him, Gimli, and Legolas. If you weren't sure Gimli and Legolas were friends before, you can be certain of it now. But after this moment, the three don't hardly speak again. Missing here is the banter and friendly rivalry which builds between Book Gimli and Éomer, and the true cause for Gimli's ire. Gimli takes great offense to Éomer's words on Galadriel and retorts with this burn. The rider looked at them with renewed wonder, but his eyes hardened. "Then there is a lady of the Golden Wood, as old tales tell," he said. "Few escape her nets, they say. These are strange days. But if you have her favor, then you also are net weavers and sorcerers, maybe." He turned a cold glance suddenly upon Legolas and Gimli. "Why do you not speak silent ones?" he demanded. Gimli rose and planted his feet firmly apart. His hands gripped the handle of his axe, and his dark eyes flashed. "Give me your name, Horsemaster, and I shall give you mine, and more besides," he said. "As for that," said the rider, staring down at the dwarf, "the stranger should declare himself first. Yet I am named Éomer, son of Éomund, and am called the third marshal of the Riddermark." "Then, Éomer, son of Éomund, third marshal of the Riddermark, let Gimli the dwarf, Gloin's son, warn you against foolish words. You speak evil of that which is fair beyond the reach of your thought, and only little wit can excuse you." Éomer's eyes blazed. The men of Rohan murmured angrily and closed in, advancing their spears. "I would cut off your head, beard and all, Master Dwarf, if it stood but a little higher from the ground," said Éomer. "He stands not alone," said Legolas, bending his bow and fitting an arrow with hands that moved quicker than sight. "You would die before your stroke fell." Éomer raised his sword, and things might have gone ill, but Aragorn sprang between them and raised his hand. "Your pardon, Éomer," he cried. "When you know more, you will understand why you have angered my companions. We intend no evil to Rohan, nor to any of its folk, neither to man nor to horse. Will you not hear our tale before you strike?" "I will," said Éomer, lowering his blade. "But wanderers in the Riddermark would be wise to be less haughty in these days of doubt." Now, it doesn't seem that Éomer is quite so unhinged. Gimli, an intruder, directly insulted him in front of all of his men, so he has to treat him with harsh words now. The films instead just have him jump straight to death threats, and not idle ones either, seeing that he has a whole company at his hand. Legolas then defends Gimli, and Aragorn stops a fight from breaking out just in time, as we all remember. And this is about where the similarities stop, though. Aragorn has Anduril from the outset of his quest, and he reveals his stature at near 100% power. I must say, Éomer's relationship is also greatly reduced with near everyone from book to film. He does have small interactions with others here and there, but his only meaningful relationship would be with Éowyn. He doesn't even get his send-off with Theoden later. We're just supposed to assume he becomes King of Rohan. Wait. I have to stop myself here because this is turning from a Gimli bit into an Éomer one. In short, because we get so much less of Éomer, we are deprived of yet another likable aspect of Gimli, who eventually agrees to disagree on the hotness of Middle-earth elves at the end of the story, when Gimli picks Galadriel as his #1 smash, and Éomer picks Arwen. It's Gimli that brings about this change in him. The personality of Gimli is key. Yes, he is funny, a bit goofy at times, rowdy, uncouth, a heavy drinker and smoker, all things that fit the stereotypical dwarven persona. But let us not forget that he is that persona. He is the dwarven archetype for which all of these later creations would trend after. If not for Gimli, then this might still be the portrayal of the average fantasy dwarf, much to the bane of Tyrion Lannister. Something I've come to notice on rewatches is that Gimli's belligerence is dialed up a bit from book to film. In the books, Gimli, like Boromir, is often a voice of dissent within the party. He has no trouble saying his piece despite his companions very often disagreeing with him. Something noteworthy, though, is that Gimli's takes are often correct or usually extremely justified. He is justified to take issue with being singled out at the prospect of being blindfolded at Lorien. He's right when he suggests resting while he, Aragorn, and Legolas are pursuing the orcs. And he's certainly not wrong with his hard truths to Éomer. The problem is that he goes as far as he needs to. Anything more, and he actually might be wrong. So when Gimli is less agreeable in the movies by a lot, he's very often proven wrong. Some of this is probably to serve pacing, but it comes off to me as a suboptimal shortcut at times. Gone is Aragorn and Gandalf's debate as to which way to go about the mountains in the books. Nor is there much mystery as to what makes Moria so dangerous. Gandalf just knows that Durin's Bane is indeed the Balrog. Even Saruman knows it. And despite this, Gimli is extremely confident that Balin and company are still alive and well inside of Moria. He doesn't seem to think anything of being told by Gandalf that Moria would only be taken as a desperate last option. But Gimli seems to see Moria as a way to seek closure for Balin. It is heavily implied that he knows the expedition failed. But he's family, and he's gonna turn up for him anyway if his quest allows it. Right off the bat, as he's introduced, Gimli replaces any speaking part Glóin would have had in the films at the Council of Elrond. Understandable, but it comes with a cost. Where Glóin has a sudden bout of disagreement with the elves in the books, and we know where he's coming from, thanks to the Hobbit, Gimli just has unfiltered yet admittedly based elf hatred. Talking about Éomer, though, has me evaluating his adaptation as well. I suppose I should be thankful for his inclusion, but to cut a long analysis less long, he appears to be a device for exposition, and the means of victory at the end of the Two Towers. His relationship with his sister is well established, at least, with some elaboration in The Return of the King, but it's a far cry from what we get in the books. He's certainly a minor character in the grand scheme of things regarding the films, but his close relationships with Gimli, Theoden, and Aragorn are sorely missing. Heck, we're back to him. I should also point out that Aragorn falls a little short here in the film too, grimacing at Gimli's remarks, when his book counterpart should have had his back nearly as much as Legolas does, to which Gimli returns the favor at the gates of Edoras in the books. The three truly are unshakable at this stage in the journey. But I digress. I'll stop criticizing Aragorn for a change. Temporarily. Gimli is the kind of character whose value is often underestimated. His story touches that of many other characters, and a removal of these dynamics is hard to spin as anything other than a downgrade. In short, what began as a critique of Gimli related much to that of Éomer as well. While that's not necessarily a bad thing for the sake of the films if you are discounting the books, an additional caveat is that I would place Éomer much lower on the totem pole in terms of character arc priority. Many adaptations have omitted him entirely, even. And the fact that the films omit similarly minor characters like Fatty Bulger and Tom Bombadil doesn't actually affect their quality per se. It just so happens that Éomer, while having a small arc of his own, adds much to the major characters whose images suffer due to the absence of him or any equatable surrogate. That being said, I do like him. Carl Urban's just that kind of guy. And I very much like Gimli. The problem is, Gimli is a much more important character than he at first seems or is so often remembered, as I said before. Tolkien's work is just too fundamental to not get right without some heavy critique. Yes, when creating his world, he pretty much ripped off the wizard class from Merlin, but he then gave us the ranger class, fantasy elves as they are now known, and in a much more unchanged way, dwarves. Tolkien even changed the plural spelling of both elves and dwarves to what we use now. Since their modern conception of the two races, elves have experienced more change, to the point where they're now only recognizable in their own universe by pointy ears. But in more tasteful stories, they still, by and large, retain many of their qualities Tolkien pretty much set into their nature. Much more attractive than humans on average, more in tune with magic, older, and more graceful. But while other fantasy series have made great strides to differentiate elves from the more angelic portrayal they receive from Tolkien. Dwarves are practically ripped straight from his universe every time. They are set in stone so well that they're even harder for the Rings of Power to screw up. In 1937, there were two big media sources we can point to that prominently feature dwarves: Snow White and The Hobbit.
Yeah, somehow Tolkien beat Disney to the punch when it came to naming the dwarves.
And he didn't do it with just The Hobbit alone. He accomplished it with the compelling portrayal of Gimli on paper. So why does Gimli seemingly come off as so much more hand-fisted in the movies? Well, to say what hasn't already been said, it's because movie Gimli is a product of his time. 50 years later, he reflects the dwarven qualities that appear in the mainstream Tolkien trenched himself. But Jackson, while picking up on these qualities, and working them into Gimli's movie character, failed to recognize what truly made Gimli great. The fact that he can be the most stereotypical dwarf ever, and still be eloquent, sentimental, stoic, solemn, even belligerent, all of which are elements book Gimli can be defined by, whereas movie Gimli can be defined by his comedic relief. At the very least, Jackson preserved some of Gimli's essence.
And that really does shine through a fantastic performance by John.
The Shades of Dunharrow. Originally akin to the Dunlendings of the Second Age, they swore allegiance to Isildur but failed to uphold their oath when called upon to defend the land from the legions of the enemy. Some cult worship of Sauron may or may not have had something to do with this failure to appear before Isildur. It seems that Numenor may not have been Sauron's only victory with this sort of game. For their oath-breaking, the men of this region were cursed. They eventually dwindled and perished, leading to the spot of canyon waste between Rohan and Gondor to be called the Paths of the Dead. The film treats us to some incredible sequences at this locale, helped by some awesome practical effects. And Howard Shore's compositions here really shine, as they do throughout the whole film. Shore's music makes the passing of the Grey Company an incredibly creepy sequence. You really get a sense of darkness from this track. And it's actually incredible how seamless all the compositions pair with the original telling of the story. There's a base elemental quality to all of these performances that really seem to capture the woods, the fields, and the true nature of Middle-earth. And it's especially apparent here, warning us that whatever lies beyond the dark door should not be faced by any but the most steadfast of heart and will. If only this incredible work was not undercut by more slapstick from Gimli. When the dead men appear before Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli, they immediately establish themselves as a terrifying force that closes in on our heroes, creating tension that you could almost cut with an... It makes me think back to the build-up to the confrontation at Weathertop. Tense, visually stunning, a captivating score which commands the attention of the viewer. All to make a scene so memorable it might as well be etched into the stone of Eric itself. But with these great payoffs comes a hefty price. The use of the ghosts by Tolkien was more than a bit obtuse for a reason. Moviegoers might be shocked to learn that most of their action takes place off-screen in the books, and is, by comparison to the films, greatly reduced in effective use. This limited contact with the ghosts is multifaceted. For one, it doesn't fully tell the reader what they're actually capable of doing. Gimli himself ponders if the ghosts are even able to physically hurt living men, as none appear to have actually done so when they faced off against the Corsairs of Umbar. They just scared them all. This keeps them mysterious, which helps to preserve their creepiness factor. They are indeed powerful in some way, as the Corsairs themselves are dreadful foes. And here they come in 50 warships. The Corsairs are of tremendous importance to the enemy's plan to take Minas Tirith, and their coming spells doom for the forces of good in the books. But hey, some great acting from Viggo tells us that this still holds quite true in the movies. We actually get that point across quite well. Their presence at the Pelennor turns a near hopeless victory into a definite defeat. What Éomer mistakes as their arrival in the books ends up serving as the true defining point of his arc. Instead of falling to despair, as his former pragmatic self likely would have, He laughs in the face of death and proves himself worthy to inherit the crown he's just come into. Unsurprisingly, the ghosts serve Aragorn's rise to the kingship as well. Having just received his banner in the books, he unfurls it at the Stone of Eric, and does only what the king-to-be, heir of Isildur, might do. He calls the dead men to fulfill their oath, and fully intends to hold them to it. Since the forging of Anduril, this is by far the most prominent act that Aragorn takes to reveal his station at this point, especially in front of so many others. It is after this point which the ghosts act in the making of the king. While few actual humans are willing to follow Aragorn with the dead men in tow, his overthrow of the Corsairs using the ghosts allows Aragorn to rally the people living along the way to the Pelennor, rallying the free people behind his banner. They man the ships the Corsairs fled and travel with him to Minas Tirith. Ghosts no longer in tow, as their oaths have been fulfilled. There's a certain specificity within the oath that they took for Aragorn. The oath that they took before Isildur was simply to fight against Sauron, for which they never showed up. This would imply that they would be in service to Isildur until they were dismissed. Had at any point they deserted, then they could still be subject to oath-breaking. However, it seems that in both versions, Aragorn accounts for the nature of the ghosts as well as the practicality of their service to him. In the book, he specifies where to go and what to do. This stretch of land between the Pelargir and the Anduin must be clean of all servants of Sauron. So why doesn't Aragorn use these invincible warriors to their fullest potential? Well, that's because it may carry a level of risk. A. The power level of the ghosts is indeterminate. They may have sway over normal men, but up against the Witch King, they could be turned away. 2. They're oath-breakers and have shown themselves to be fickle allies before. It would be unwise for Aragorn to use them in a fight against the adversary for whom they already betrayed Isildur over. There's a good chance they worship Sauron, and it's likely he has some measure of authority still over them. Plus, the point about power levels I brought up about the Witch King comes into play here even more so. And even if Sauron can't mentally dominate them and bend their will, which I personally would find very likely, he could still manipulate them and convince them to fight for him. He is known as the Deceiver, after all, and these aren't the most trustworthy of allies to begin with. And D, Aragorn is playing it safe with the wording of the oath. He needs to be in the right, both in spirit and in technicality. As soon as they provide a great service to him, he holds their oath fulfilled and dismisses them. It would be unlike Aragorn and unbefitting of a king to extort these tortured souls for more servitude. And fate tends to have something to say about these sort of things. In the books, it's always stressed that the right thing needs to be done in the end. And something that I've always found lacking in the movies is that there's not much emphasis on fate itself. This is where Aragorn extorting the ghosts on any sort of technicality might really become a problem. If he ill-uses the spirit of the oath, then it might really come back to haunt him. Literally. So, Aragorn is actually fine to dismiss the Oathbreakers here. The only problem is that the audience could really use an explanation here to help understand why it's okay. Gimli even seemingly points out their potential, but instead of taking a chance to explain anything, Aragorn just dismisses them. The real damage here is to Rohan's forces, who sacrifice themselves on the Pelennor. The right of the Rohirrim is made less so, because of the fact that the city has already been breached, and the fact that the coming of the ghosts means that the good guys were gonna win anyway. Yes, they saved a lot of lives, but they also lost a lot of their own. So, we have some book-supported reasons for their dismissal, but some problems are introduced by their inclusion at the Siege of Minas Tirith. I get why Jackson didn't want to halt things here with a lengthy explanation, but there's actually a very good reason why Aragorn could dismiss the ghosts here with only a couple lines. Even in the context of the film, on its own, Aragorn is shown to release the ghosts only after they do the fighting. He has to supervise the fact that they held to their oath. If Aragorn dies, for example, going on a suicide mission, then he may not be around to actually release them. This is a bit of saving grace on the film's part, but it is an aspect where the filmmakers would have benefited from capturing some of Tolkien's fixation on particulars. I have no doubt that he would have raised issue with the lack of clarity here upon his first viewing. Denethor. What an interesting character. Tolkien's metaphor for petty political shenanigans, Theoden's foil, Aragorn's rival, and the conclusive answer to the senseless argument that Tolkien was somehow in approval of the occult.
We shall burn like the heathen kings of old.
Funnily enough, though, he was actually a good ruler prior to the events of the story, something that I appreciate the Fellowship using Boromir to touch up on. Sort of, at least.
I mean, this line implies that his rule at one time, at least somewhat worked. It's a start, but unfortunately the rest of the films are otherwise very happy to portray him quite one-dimensionally.
He starts off insane before we meet him in real time in the story. Don't believe me? Well, the beacons need to be lit, and Gandalf comments on the dire hour. Denethor is obviously late in doing this, and Boromir's death only just reached him within maybe the past couple of days. Book Denethor does not need to be told to light the beacons, nor is he in complete denial of what is happening around him. Book Denethor is leading the city astray. He's an obstacle for Gandalf, but not the complete bulwark he is in the films. The block-headed imbecile he gets portrayed as. He is in fact formidable, which actually makes him a greater threat. It's not until he relinquishes command to Gandalf that things begin to actually turn for the better, and it is afterwards where he actually starts to resemble his movie counterpart more closely. When we first meet him in real time in the Jackson trilogy, he pretty much starts off the same person he ends up as in the books. And it didn't even take his favorite son's death to make a start towards that utter insanity. I cannot think of a character in the Legendarum with a more severe case of Flanderization. I actually have trouble imagining how film Denethor has kept his seat and not been usurped by some other ruler in Minas Tirith. The only explanation my brain allows is that there are no other figures to fit this mold. The various princes are absent in the films, so on top of Denethor being simplified, the world is as well. Not a bad thing in itself, actually. It would be difficult for film audiences to keep up with so many characters, and that's all the more reason for Denethor to remain three-dimensional, instead of what we get in the films. In our first scene with him, Gandalf prepares Pippin, and by extension the viewer, to meet Denethor by cautioning him on what not to say, similarly to how he does in the book, but diverging with a joke.
In fact, it's better if you don't speak at all, Bergen.
I actually love that, but the scene strays too far afterwards. In fact, all of the scenes that follow involving Denethor are broken up in such a way that complicates direct comparisons. But I'll try. The approach to Denethor's seat is foreboding, and echoes the book. An old, quiet spider, he sat. I especially love the detail that his throne is not the king's, just like in the book, and true to that of a steward. I have to say it's far easier to gush over these movies than to explain their faults. They're largely 9 out of 10 experiences for me. Probably my favorite trilogy in cinema history ever. Right behind the Santa Claus in the extended Tim Allen cinematic Christmas universe. Oh yeah, the bad parts. Pippin's pledging himself to Denethor is nice, and we get a gleam of appreciation in Denethor's face.
Get up.
But it is undermined by a dig from Gandalf.
When in truth, Gandalf would be the first person to admire an act like this, especially coming from someone as carefree as Pippin. To further separate Gandalf from his book counterpart, his lines regarding this notion are given to Faramir.
Generous deed should not be checked with cold counsel.
The rest of the scenes fall somewhat short of the mark. Denethor alludes to having a palantir. Maybe. That's never confirmed, and indeed a controversial decision by the filmmakers, as Denethor's madness is now more prolonged, extreme, and less explainable. But what disappoints me in all of these scenes is that at no point do we see any contest of wit between him and Gandalf. Denethor is described in this scene as giving the impression of possessing great wisdom, appearing older than Gandalf even, with a kingly air about him, like that of Aragorn. There are great duels with words that I can point to throughout all of media, early Game of Thrones being one of them, with loaded language present at every turn. Double meaning is baked into each word.
Can you imagine the celebrations? They'll ring the bells all day and night.
Remember, anything you need.
We don't quite get that here. We have nice music, fine presentation, and cool sounding lines, but wordcraft should be the primary weapon in Denethor's arsenal. And again, he's up against Gandalf. The back and forth here should be legendary. and in the end we just use it for a title drop, crescendoing in a rather anticlimactic and untrue statement.
The rule of Gondor is mine, and no others.
Well, Denethor, as acting steward, is very willing to cast aside the law, in words, the law to which a stake was claimed so solidly before. But even then, a similar proclamation is made here in the books. Denethor does not respect the line of Isildur alone, and in the end, he wishes for the state of the world to return to that of his younger days. But this is an errant speech made in the throes of his madness just before burning. Saying anything comparable to it here is premature, ham-fisted, and these actions do indeed belie the man we are supposed to believe him to be. Without his Palantir, this version of Denethor has not the skill nor powers of deduction to come to the conclusions he has here. And it is through this loss that I think that so many critics are able to misconstrue and wrongfully simplify the world of Tolkien. Yes, he didn't waste time with superfluous fluff surrounding economics. He chose instead to focus on developing complex languages and an origin story for the universe, for which he would derive vast genealogies of characters from. But his stories are not without political strife. I hope that the following excerpt illustrates for you what I find to be missing from the films. For what indeed is better than subtext, if not characters with a wit to read along with us?
And now, said Denethor, my first command to you, speak and be not silent. Tell me your full tale, and see that you recall all that you can of Boromir, my son. Sit now and begin.
As soon as he spoke, he struck a small silver gong that stood near his footstool, and at once servants came forward. Pippin saw that they had been standing in the alcoves on either side of the door, unseen as he and Gandalf entered. Bring wine and food and seats for the guests, said Denethor, and see that none trouble us for 1 hour. It is all that I have to spare. There is much else to heed, he said to Gandalf. Much of more import, it may seem, and yet to me less pressing. But maybe we can speak again at the end of the day.
And earlier 'tis to be hoped, said Gandalf, for I have not ridden hither from Isengard 150 leagues with the speed of wind, only to bring you one small warrior, however courteous. Is it not to you that Theoden has fought a great battle, and that Isengard is overthrown, and that I have broken the staff of Saruman? It is much to me, and I know already sufficient of these deeds for my own counsel against the menace of the East.
He turned his dark eyes on Gandalf, and now Pippin saw a likeness between the two, and he felt the strain between them, almost as if a line of smoldering fire, drawn from eye to eye, that might suddenly burst into flame. Denethor looked indeed much more like a great wizard than Gandalf did, more kingly, beautiful, and powerful, and older. Yet, by a sense other than sight, Pippin perceived that Gandalf had the greater power, and the deeper wisdom, and a majesty that was veiled, and he was older, far older. How much older? He wondered. And then he thought about how odd it was that he had never thought about it before. Treebeard had said something about wizards, but even then he had not thought of Gandalf as one of them. What was Gandalf? In what far time and place did he come into the world, and when would he leave it? And then his musings broke off, and he saw that Denethor and Gandalf still looked each other in the eye, as if reading the other's mind. But it was Denethor who first withdrew his gaze. Yea, he said, for though the stones be lost, they say, still the lords of Gondor have keener sight than lesser men, and many messages come to them. But sit now. The men came bearing a chair and a low stool, and one brought a salver with a silver flagon and cups, and white cakes. Pippin sat down, but he could not take his eyes from the old lord. Was it so, or had he imagined it? That as he spoke of the stones, a sudden gleam of his eye had glanced upon Pippin's face. Now, tell me your tale, my liege, said Denethor, half kindly, half mockingly. For words of whom my son so befriended will be welcome indeed. Pippin never forgot that hour in the great hall under the piercing eye of the Lord of Gondor, stabbed ever and anon by his shrewd questions, and all the while conscious of Gandalf at his side, watching and listening, and, so Pippin felt, holding a check of rising wrath and impatience. When the hour was over, and Denethor again rang the gong, Pippin felt worn out. "It cannot be more than 9 o'clock," he thought. "I could now eat 3 breakfasts on end." "Lead the Lord Mithrandir to the housing prepared for him," said Denethor, "and his companion may lodge with him for the present, if he will. But be it known that I have now sworn him into my service, and he shall be known as Peregrine, son of Paladin, and taught the lesser passwords. Send word to the captains that they shall wait on me here, as soon as may be after the 3rd hour has rung. And you, Lord Mithrandir, shall come too, as and when you will. None shall hinder your coming to me at any time, save only in my brief hours of sleep. Let your wrath at an old man's folly run off, and then return to my comfort." "Folly," said Gandalf. "Nay, my lord, when you are doted you will die. You can use even your grief as a cloak. Do you think that I do not understand your purpose in questioning for an hour one who knows the least while I sit by?" "If you understand it, then be content," returned Denethor. "Pride would be the folly that disdained help and counsel at need. But you deal out such gifts according to your own designs. Yet the Lord of Gondor is not to be made the tool of other men's purposes, however worthy, and to him there is no purpose higher in the world as it now stands than the good of Gondor, and the rule of Gondor, my lord, is mine, and no other man's, unless the king should come again." "Unless the king should come again," said Gandalf. "Well, my lord steward, it is your task to keep some kingdom still against that event, which few now look to see. In that task you shall have all the aid that you are pleased to ask for. But I will say this, the rule of no realm is mine, neither of Gondor, nor any other, great or small, but all worthy things that are in peril as the world now stands, those are my care. And for my part, I shall not wholly fail of my task, though Gondor should perish. If anything passes this night that can still grow fair or bear fruit or flower again in the days to come. For I am also a steward. Did you not know?" And with that he turned and strode from the hall with Pippin running at his side. Let's talk about this scene. Probably one of the few scenes I would cut out entirely. I'm going to use personal anecdotes again, I know, but any book reader that I've ever watched this scene with has audibly sighed or groaned in frustration at this part at least once. We have some build-up to this scene earlier in the film, but that still doesn't help it.
Sauron has yet to reveal his deadliest servant. You have met him before. He stabbed Frodo on Weathertop. Sauron has yet to reveal. You have met him before.
At the siege of Minas Tirith, Pippin seeks out Gandalf during Denethor's madness. They meet up, and Gandalf rides to save Faramir. He's one-shot at a troll at this point, and is far away the most powerful piece on White's side of the board. He then encounters the Witch King and gets absolutely domed.
Go back to the abyss! Fall into the nothingness that awaits you and your master!
Do you not know death when you see it, old man? This is my power. World of men will fall.
There's just no ambiguity here. He gets his rocked. Of course, this is a rendition of a scene from the novel, which plays out quite differently. It would probably be a surprise to movie-exclusive fans to learn that the Dark Forces do not enter Minas Tirith at all in the books. Yes, the White City's gates do get breached by Grond, who looks like a pig in the movie, but Gandalf is there upon Shadowfax, staring down the Witch King and the entire army. In the film, they obviously wanted a confrontation between Gandalf and the Witch King as well, but they went for a more dire approach. With the lower city being flooded, this already squanders Gandalf greatly. Before, he was the White City's last and most powerful defense. But now, he's simply a very powerful fighter on the side of light. That's already a big step down. So, he encounters the Witch King, with fear in his eyes no less, and he feebly echoes his lines from the book. The Witch King actually says what he's supposed to say, pretty word for word, and then several things happen. After lighting his sword, the Witch King screams so loud it bursts Gandalf's staff, and he falls off Shadowfax, who is also ill-served by this sequence by panicking before the Witch King. So this in isolation from the books could be fine, right? Well, Gandalf has been set up as an uber-powerful player in the game. In his weaker form, he was able to duel and defeat a Balrog while climbing a mountain. I mean, they fell for at least a mile and then fought for multiple days after. The Witch King himself has already been dunked on by Aragorn in the first movie. And at that time, he didn't even have Anduril. And the Witch King had 4 comrades with him then. After that, the 9 gets handled by Arwen, so what gives? Well, he gets crowned in this movie, and that implies he got a bit of a level up. And this actually happens in the books, but not to such an extreme effect. It's much more ambiguous what this actually does. I mean, we're talking DBZ levels of a power jump here, and even if that's the excuse, all of a sudden Sauron can just make minions more powerful like this? What stopped him from doing it until now? He would already have the ring in his possession if that were the case. It's just kind of insane to me that he can turn what was at one time a mortal man into something so strong it can defeat the most powerful wizard in the history of Middle-earth with ease. You should really consider doing that more often. I mean, if the Witch King is that strong, then nobody should be able to stop him. Things are a bit all over the place here. Yada yada yada. Enchanted daggers in the books. In the movies, he just kind of waits to die. This is a small scene, but it has big implications that remain just that. The Witch King conveniently doesn't kill Gandalf here, despite having him dead to rights. No, he can't wait 2 seconds to kill Theoden. He has to go kill Theoden right now. He can't stab Gandalf while he's on the ground. That would be too much of a delay. No, I mean, the only consequence of this scene is that Gandalf's staff is now missing from the rest of the film. Yeah, this really should have stayed on the cutting room floor of the extended edition. I said earlier that Gandalf battled the Witch King and the rest of the 9 at Weathertop during the night, when they're most powerful. But even if we exclude this and go by only the logic from the films, it still doesn't make sense for Gandalf to be getting served in this manner either. And Shadowfax would never cower or panic before the enemy like that. The valiant nature and light from either of these beings should be enough to make the Witch King check himself. But this isn't the only time Gandalf backs down. The Mouth of Sauron. One of the coolest yet most flawed scenes in the trilogy. This interpretation of Sauron's future lieutenant after Saruman and the Witch King has no contest in any other version.
Frodo!
Silence.
No!
Nobody's got anything on him when it comes to style points. We've got a bit of a different story when it comes to the portrayal of our heroes, however. Gandalf once again comes up short and a bit impotent. A far cry from his book reaction. And then there's we have a joke inserted here to distract us from the rather unkingly action taken by Aragorn, whom, even more so importantly than Gandalf, should not be stooping to any less than honorable level when fighting the enemy. It's tactics such as this that don't turn out well historically in Tolkien's Legendarum. Both Aragorn and Gandalf do not render themselves solo in the books. There is no victory in what is done in the scene from the movie. The only justification here is that Aragorn was trying to protect Frodo because of the use of his right name by Pippin. Sauron could have pieced together that this was indeed the ring-bearer. After he goes missing, well, let's just say it could all prove disastrous in the long run. And in any case, this series of events is rather unlike most things to take place in Tolkien's world. What's the moral behind this action? Kill your enemies when they get you down with words? The Mouth of Sauron should have been beaten at his own game. And it didn't matter if this was from Gandalf or Aragorn or heck, even Gimli for what it's worth here. In conclusion, Ian McKellen delivers a superb performance as Gandalf the Grey, but somewhere down the line we didn't quite nail Gandalf the White. There are glimpses of an awesome performance, and these pop up here and there. His intro is quite strong and his exorcism of Saruman is amazing. But elsewhere his performance suffers, I think, from director's decisions. Mostly. I mean, Ian McKellen is strongest when he's being grave and personable. But there's a haughtiness apparent at times that seems to suit Gandalf the Grey rather endearingly, but doesn't lend itself to Gandalf the White so much. It doesn't help that he's hurt so much by the writing in the later films. This little scene is a good example of what I mean.
Where are Theoden's riders? Where Rohan's army come? With Threndir.
Courage is the best defense that you have now.
Gandalf, it's your job more than anyone's to build these people up and give them hope. You were able to find it here, and this scene's great. His acting is on point here, but I think it's more evidence from my earlier point regarding Ian McKellen's acting style. But here we have Mithrandir the Doomer. I would err on the side of this being the fault of direction, for probably 90%, especially seeing that Ian is able to provide the punch and gravitas needed during the Balrog scene, one of the most memorable movie moments of all time. And a point in the writer and director's favor, "You shall not pass" is superior to the "you cannot pass" of the book. I must say, I really would have liked to have seen Christopher Lee's rendition of Gandalf. I think he would have been able to pull off both versions of the character superbly, but exchanging his performance for Saruman would be a tough sell. It doesn't hurt that he literally outacts Ian McKellen in every scene they share, though. I would be a little less harsh on Ian if not for this fact. The voice of Saruman, the next to last chapter of Book 4, is supposed to be Gandalf's time to shine over Saruman, and he just doesn't do that here. Christopher Lee steals the show. I won't mince words, though. As disappointed as I am sometimes for his white version, Gandalf the Grey is near flawlessly portrayed, and I'm thankful we got as strong an actor as we did.
Gandalf, that was what they used to call me.
I told Gandalf I would keep you safe. I told Gandalf.
Gandalf, that was what they used to call me.
I've saved this for last, as it is barely talked about in any negative fashion, and the primary character in question is usually praised for their portrayal. The problem here is that a certain character is given justification and even ammunition for their evil actions in the films, whereas in the books it is clear that the state of said character, while pitiable, is indeed their own fault. This is a perversion of Tolkien's message and work, and I did not say this lightly. By now, you may have already guessed who I'm talking about. Gollum, formerly known as Smeagol, is a character whom the sympathy card is pulled a few too many times for in the films. This comes with several fundamental changes, one being that he almost turns a new leaf. Almost. If not for the actions of two characters which undergo nothing short of assassination by Jackson. Let's start from the beginning, when Smeagol sees Deagle with the ring. An immediate hold is placed on the minds of both proto-hobbits. I will not call them Harfoots. They are pitted against each other over the ring, and the one who ultimately desires it more prevails. This enchanting hypnotism is immediate, and lacks the subtlety of the ring's influence from the books, which, since they're without the ever-remembered scene of Isildur, uses Boromir and Bilbo to illustrate the long-term effects of the ring on people. It can and will take hold of people's minds, and everyone in some part finds it difficult to resist. Almost. But the point Tolkien ultimately makes is that it's the quality of the person that is most important here. Boromir, so mighty a man as he was, and very much a noble and worthy soul, still felt the ring's influence after prolonged exposure. Yes, there was an initial pull, but he was able to do a really good job at resisting it. Frodo had been safe with him up until the party left Lorien. It's at this point Boromir starts looking for chances to catch hold of Frodo alone. In the movies, he's just after firewood and happens upon Frodo, but I'll get back to that. For now, just know that Boromir was pushed to a point to try and take the ring. He was not about to kill Frodo as soon as he met him over it. Smeagol, on the other hand, demonstrates that he had murder in his heart the whole time, when he first demands the ring and then sets upon Deagle in the books, because it was golden and shiny. This isn't regular murder. I think just about anyone could be pushed enough under the right circumstances to kill somebody. But Smeagol saw something he coveted and killed his friend for it. Yes, Deagle coveted it too, but there was no fight described. And an apt analogy would be someone with a winning lottery ticket being suddenly set upon and killed by their best friend. This was a murder for something material. Smeagol is a betrayer and murderer in the books, but this is not so cut and dry in the movies. Here, the binary of right and wrong is murkier. Smeagol and Deagle are under the influence of the ring so fast that it's unclear whether or not they can even be held responsible for their actions. I would err on the side of no, because it seems that rather than bringing out the darkness that's already inside one's heart, or any ill will that's festered over time, the ring just mind controls you to fight to the death over it. Movie Smeagol cannot be held accountable for his murder of Deagle. After all, it seems that Jackson and crew took Gandalf's words on sadness, mercy, and pity to craft a different recollection of events. One where the unfortunate state of Gollum is simply because he was at one time a victim of circumstance. It is the abuse of pity that gives Gollum the ammunition for his wrongdoings later in the films. Once he has the ring, Smeagol goes on to steal, spread gossip, and cause as much mischief as he pleases. He's a character that categorically fails the test of the Ring of Gyges, a thought experiment from Plato's Republic. It's a ring that makes you invisible. But the question is, are you the sort of person who would do wrong while wearing it? Do you keep yourself in line based on your own integrity, or just because people are watching? A smidge of consequence-free power is given to any ring bearer by default. Sam uses it, even in Mordor, but this is only there for a short time before the real comeuppance comes to get you. However good your intentions start out, the power of the ring corrupts utterly, and when Smeagol was given power, he used it for petty kicks. Despite this, even though he's a poor wretch who may have dug his own grave, it's still a sad story. So, changing the story to make Smeagol relatable and even more sympathetic than he already is at best unnecessary, and at worst extremely harmful to the morals the character is supposed to teach, and the story and arcs of other characters as well. Samwise the Brave. He's 1/9 of the Fellowship and 99% of its power. Out of the supporting hobbits in the first movie, his portrayal might be the strongest, as it's not reduced to burglary like Merry and Pip, though he still has some competition from Frodo in this regard. His arc is even streamlined in a way that improves it for the film's sake, with the promise he originally made to Gildor in the Exiles instead changed to a promise to Gandalf, delivered in a scene that, following the death of Boromir, packs more punch than it does in the books. This really is one of those times where a movie rendition of a scene is just flat out better than its book counterpart. There's pretty much no debate here. Throughout the journey, Sam never gives up, even in the face of oblivion. When a child of Ungoliant stands atop his best friend and master, he doesn't stop to wonder what is to be done, or whether or not he's brave or strong. He charges forward and engages a foe that not Beren nor Turin has the strength to harm seriously. If not for Sam, the quest would have failed at several key points, not least of all because when Sam acquires the ring from Frodo's body, one of the most important internal struggles in the novel occurs. Sam feels the urge to take the ring out of anger, and then to find Gollum and kill him for his treachery. But he relents. He realizes that it would not be worth it to leave his master for that reason. It would not bring him back, nor would it be what he wants. Instead, he takes the ring for the noble reason of finishing the quest, realizing that he was appointed to do so, as he is the last of the company, and he even promises to return to Frodo and die beside him when all is done. Had Sam taken the ring in anger, he would have been consumed. But he's not the sort of person to do that. What's more is that this isn't even the only time where Sam is tested like this without ever realizing it. Another point where the quest would have failed is when Gollum ambushes the hobbits on the slopes of Mount Doom. Frodo had just used the power of the ring to curse Gollum should he harm him again, and then rushes for the cracks of Doom. Sam and Gollum are left alone, and just when it looks like Gollum will pursue Frodo, Sam charges at him with Sting, only for Gollum to fall flat and beg for his life. Here is the traitor who Sam has despised from the very onset of their meeting, the villain with whom he has butted heads with at every turn, and had even laid hands on his master. Here he begs for mercy on the ground and asks only for his life. And why? Why should he not die after everything that he's done? Because of mercy for its own sake. Sam spares Gollum, despite his feelings towards him. Had he not done so, then Frodo would never have cast the ring into the fire. In the words of Tolkien, Sam is the chief hero of the Fellowship, and, frankly, more of a protagonist than Frodo. In fact, while only a small part of Fellowship is told from his perspective, the Two Towers switches POV from Frodo to Sam quite often, and the book ends with following Sam. I would estimate a little over half of Book 4 is from Sam's POV. And in The Return of the King, the second book is almost entirely from Sam's perspective. We even end the story on him, and the final parts are implied to be authored by him as well. Samwise Gamgee is one of the most beloved characters in fiction, recognized for his utter selflessness, genuine heart, and legendary willpower. However, the films kind of have a problem with true greatness. Gandalf, Aragorn, Gimli, and some others do not live up to their novel counterparts, and Sam falls short of the mark too, unfortunately. Sam makes it out of the first film pretty much unscathed, though he does have one scene particularly worthy of note taken away, just before the fight at Amon Hen, where the rest of the Fellowship debates while Frodo is alone. Just before the breaking of the Fellowship, Sam, with his plain Hobbit sense, points out the futility of heading towards Minas Tirith, a wayward task in the grand scheme of things and duty only to Boromir, as he points out. Yet despite this, several of the party members still wanted to go. Legolas and even Aragorn wanted to go, as Aragorn was bringing the Sword of Elendil, and Legolas, I can't really remember why. Maybe he just recognized the risk of continuing east while they were being tracked by Gollum. But the point is, the temptation of going to Minas Tirith is merely that, an alluring distraction. It is Sam who breaks out of this line of thinking, rightfully pointing out that to do this would be to tarry. And when he says this, they actually realize that Boromir is gone. And he just returns and explains, "Oh man, Frodo ran off into the woods for some reason." Then the hobbits scatter in a panic and search for him, and I think you know the rest. I'll trade this scene for the one that we get of Frodo and Sam in the boat, though, which very well may be my favorite scene in the entire trilogy. To think that Jackson almost ruined it with an orc interrupting them.
We actually ended up shooting this twice, didn't we? We
Yeah.
we shot a version of it where we made it much more of an action climax.
Uruk-hai came up from under the boat, reached up, and pulled Frodo out of the boat. And they went and they had this battle underwater, and Frodo was just about dying.
In the struggle, the ring slips off of Frodo's neck and somehow, gets down in the water. And Uruk, captivated by the ring, goes for it and is so obsessed with it that he actually drowns himself trying to get the ring. And Sam is able to whack the Uruk and somehow get Frodo out of the water.
I'm glad he didn't, because I think the scene packs a lot more punch through the movie than it does through the book. Too bad the second movie changes things a lot. While I do appreciate that Frodo has much more faith in Sam's knot tying than he does in the book, he begins to immediately trust Gollum after only a brief few days of knowing him, and with how cruelly Sam treats Gollum, obviously showing jealousy with their new dynamic, it sullies the scene at Anduin and misconstrues Gandalf's words from earlier. In the books, Frodo is mistaken by Sam as someone who may be too generous in trust and kindness. Funnily enough, he also holds the contradictory belief that Frodo is the third smartest person alive, behind Bilbo and Gandalf. But Frodo surprises Sam. He gets stern with Gollum and doesn't let him manipulate him. Gollum is never able to drive a wedge between Frodo and Sam in the novel, and there's no parting on the stairs of Cirith Ungol. None of that. At one point, Sam gets a bit mean with Gollum, and Frodo gives him a look like, "Hey, calm down, guy." But I mean, that's pretty much it. Gollum's ulterior motives are also overheard much earlier by Sam, who has much more reason to mistrust him because of it. Though what Smeagol is talking to Gollum about is not so clear to Sam, and there's no confrontation from it. Their interactions overall are also marked by much less cruelty from Sam. He's hardly friendly, though some more welcoming behavior does happen at some points. Sam even offered to share the stew he made with the rabbits, which were caught at Sam's request, not ripped away from Gollum like in the movie. But Gollum gets really upset with Sam. He doesn't like that he used fire to cook them. Nasty red tongues, he calls them. It's also implied that Gollum caught a third rabbit and ate it before he brought Sam the others. There's other examples, including one major one I want to discuss, but I have to talk about the other character most affected by different Gollum first. Faramir. He's been suspiciously absent from my rant thus far, but that's about to change. Men of the West made a video concerning him that was well on the mark, but I think that there's a lot more to add. When we first meet Faramir in the second film, the hobbits spy on his company's fight with the Haradrim after the stewed rabbit. I hardly even got to taste it. Faramir emerges and captures the hobbits and borrows Sam's lines from the book.
You wonder what his name is, where he came from. If he was really evil at heart.
This, at first, makes you think that they might be planning a more thoughtful approach to the character. But no. Faramir takes the hobbits captive immediately. He soon finds out about the ring and is all about taking it to Minas Tirith to please his father. How does he find out about the ring? Well, he interrogates and tortures Gollum. Wait! Faramir, one of Tolkien's self-professed inserts, tortures Gollum. This is a grievous injustice, not only towards the character of Faramir, but towards the story's morals as a whole. Faramir is seen as Aragorn's equal, a great king born out of his time amongst these later years. Faramir is loved by his people. He thrusts himself first into danger to save his fleeing men to stop a rout, and he shows the utmost mercy to Frodo, Sam, and Gollum at every turn. Faramir's first conversation in the books takes place before the fight with the Haradrim. His men spot the smoke from Sam's cooking fire and Faramir comes with them. Gollum slinks off similar to the film, and Faramir returns to have a talk with the two hobbits. The three have quite the standoff. Indeed, quite merciful of Faramir, seeing that he has a host of men at his call. Frodo acknowledges the hopelessness of the situation, but Faramir begins by only seeking answers, rather than taking them in. He demands an account of Frodo's exploits and quickly realizes that Frodo is leaving parts out, helped by his knowledge of the rhyme and Frodo's confirmation that he and Sam indeed are the halflings named therein. However, he recognizes the sensitivity of the information Frodo is withholding, and proceeds carefully in his questioning, not just as a matter of policy, but also out of concern for these two strangers. Faramir is keenly interested in Isildur's Bane, though what Isildur's Bane is not explicitly known. There's no widespread knowledge that it in fact is the ring. When Faramir asks more about Isildur's Bane, Frodo tells him that he is not permitted to speak of it, as it is not his to talk more about. When he's told that nobody definitively would have claim to it, but if it were to come down to it, Aragorn would be the guy, Faramir is satisfied upon learning that this ranger is in fact Isildur's heir and bears the sword, though he doesn't exactly show it at first. In fact, he conceals much, behaving much like Aragorn upon his introduction to the hobbits in Bree. Frodo assures Faramir that Boromir, man of Gondor, will set this right and vouch for him when he comes back. It's here that Faramir reveals Boromir is dead. Frodo is shocked to hear this, and feels suddenly used by Faramir, trapped in words in an attempt to snare him with a falsehood. Faramir hopes that Frodo might have been able to shed light on Boromir's death, revealing a bit of his heart, for up until now, he had been solely pragmatic with his questioning, and kept his concerns I mentioned earlier hidden. When Sam finally erupts in anger at his master's interrogation, Faramir cautions him not to reveal too much, and to allow his master to choose his words as he is wiser than him. A clear distinction from his film counterpart, whom I'm honestly shocked doesn't separate the two hobbits to derive as much information as he can from them. I should also add that Faramir returns none of Sam's hostility or aggression during this exchange. It is at this point that Frodo determines Faramir to be a man not so much like Boromir. Similar, yet sterner, wiser, and less self-regarding. Faramir opens up when Frodo accurately describes Boromir, recollecting seeing his body in the boat of Lorien. In a scene the film's adapted remarkably well, I might add. What I like most is that they capture the same vision-like nature of the experience, where we're unsure if this is indeed real. Watching the film, I would err on the side that Faramir saw only a vision, yet the book really makes it seem like he saw Boromir. though neither he nor Frodo are really sure. Faramir even sings a little mourning for his brother, again, in a manner not dissimilar to Aragorn's farewell song to Boromir. Faramir and Frodo actually begin to build rapport at this point. Frodo fears the worst, that he and Sam may now be the last of the company, but Faramir dismisses this conclusion, as who else could have arrayed Boromir for a funeral? But even though he now begins to trust Frodo, he's still well aware that he has not said all. He doesn't reveal this immediately, as his men are nearby, but he declares that they need to now get on the move. This is a military operation, after all. Frodo and Sam must be blindfolded, but this is done willingly, unlike in the films, where they are immediately taken captive against their will. Faramir makes it clear here that this is the law of the land, and that if he abstains from this measure, his life will surely and rightly be forfeit. Faramir is also honest and direct about his brother, noting his personality type and how it may have led to confrontation within the Fellowship, and correctly guessing that this would have been over Isildur's bane. He remarks how he would never claim this thing for himself, even if it were a weapon of war that could deliver Gondor from certain destruction, a key difference from his film version. Knockoff Faramir gives in to the temptation of the ring right away, and doesn't even make an effort to keep it secret. Not all of his men in the immediate vicinity may know of it, but that's not stopped anyone from attempting to claim it before. With the way that the mechanics surrounding the ring have been shown to work in the films, the fact that the ring doesn't try to sow chaos amidst Faramir's men may be an issue in itself. Faramir's book lines are poached here, which he now says unironically. And this doesn't thematically work because Faramir is supposed to be the guy who should have went in place of Boromir. But on their own, movie Boromir seems to hold off the ring's temptation much better than his brother. Unlike in the books, he didn't want to go to Rivendell, and he's also specifically instructed to go and take the thing by his dad, which again, film Denethor somehow knows about despite being an idiot. Before the breaking of the Fellowship, Boromir was even away for honest reasons, collecting firewood, unlike in the book where he sought Frodo out to convince him to come to Minas Tirith one way or another. And this genuine notion of goodwill is helped by the genuine moment he shares with Frodo in Lorien. It's strongly implied that Boromir, despite his disagreements, succumbed to a moment of weakness from which he realized he was wrong. So, thanks to the bonus scene in the Two Towers, we now have an extremely sympathetic Boromir and a Faramir who is now the one who wants to go. And it's only Boromir's failure that makes him realize that he probably shouldn't take the ring. This Faramir was probably prone to the same weakness as his brother, which would be fine, but this entirely new arc nulls this scene from the third movie.
I would not use the ring.
Not if Minas Tirith were falling in ruin and I alone could save her.
Boromir would have remembered his father's need.
Boromir would not have brought the ring.
He would have stretched out his hand to this thing, and taking it he would have fallen.
You know nothing of this matter.
He would have kept it for his own. You would not have known your son.
Boromir was loyal to me!
Which is something that Gandalf says in the books. And he could still say it here, but Faramir has no right to say this because he was in the same figurative boat as Boromir. So Faramir is much less the man he is in the books here. He immediately succumbs to the ring and treats Frodo and Sam with much more hostility, dropping any pretenses about them being prisoners, and exhibiting no remorse or gratitude for their cooperation as he does in the books. And we now have to address his cruelty towards Gollum, whom he shows as much mercy as possible towards in the books. In both versions, he is ready to kill him when he's spotted in the pool, but the reasoning is a bit less clear in the movies. We're not explicitly told they can't let Gollum leave alive with knowing the location of the hideouts. Instead, we're left thinking there's some pomp and circumstance surrounding the pool.
To enter the Forbidden Pool bears the penalty of death.
Which Faramir has a line like this in the books, but it's only a metaphor. Instead of confiding in Frodo for guidance on what to do about the predicament, he coerces Frodo to instead trick Gollum, seemingly taking a bit of sadistic satisfaction throughout the whole ordeal. A far cry from his novel counterpart, who takes no joy in the killing of anything on account of his duty. His men even spare Gollum in the books at first because they're unsure of what he is, mistaking him for a kingfisher, thinking he's a big squirrel or something. Movie Faramir's men would probably not have spared him in this matter, but Faramir knows he can use Gollum to get more information about Frodo in the films, which makes his accepting of Frodo's earlier testimony all the more strange. In the book, he drops the subject of Gollum seemingly out of respect for Frodo's apprehension about the situation. He realizes that there is something he should not meddle with here, but he's forced to be convincing in front of his men. Back to Gollum, who, in the movie, innocently and full-heartedly follows Frodo's instructions and walks right into the trap. But Gollum, while not evil altogether during this moment, is still nasty enough to suspect apparent wrongdoing on Frodo's part. When he trusts Frodo anyway, and is beset by Faramir's men, he accuses Frodo of being tricksy, making his eventual betrayal all but inevitable. Movie Gollum had successfully warded off his evil half. He genuinely tried to turn a new leaf, and it's the treatment he receives from Faramir that draws Gollum back out of Smeagol, whereas this side of him just had never left in the books. This gives Gollum's future heel turn a lot of justification. He can now blame the cruel world and the evil ring that seemingly mind-controlled him, when before there was no one responsible for Gollum's wrongdoings other than himself. And none of this is helped by the terrible, ham-fisted, and quite frankly, oafish apology offered by Sam at the end of the movie.
Come on, keep up! Mr. Frodo didn't mean for them Rangers to hurt you. You know that, don't you? He's trying to save you, see? So there's no hard feelings. Forgive and forget.
Yeah, sorry you got tortured, no hard feelings, okay? I could go to lengths on how Faramir only did what was strictly necessary in the books, treating Gollum well and never laying a hand on him other than to bind him, which Frodo laments Gollum may never understand or forgive. Gollum is simply too mean to think anything else in the books. Or is he? I think the apology from Sam is inserted here because of the breakup of Frodo and Sam later on the stairs of Cirith Ungol. In the books, no such separation occurs, and Sam and Frodo get through Shelob's lair together, only for Gollum to jump Sam upon exiting while Shelob goes for Frodo. Before all of this goes down, however, we have probably one of my top 5 favorite scenes in the entire story, happening when Gollum goes to Shelob to notify her that he brought food. He returns to find Sam and Frodo asleep.
And so Gollum found them hours later when he returned, crawling and creeping down the path out of the gloom ahead. Sam sat propped against the stone, his head dropping sideways and his breathing heavy. In his lap lay Frodo's head, drowned deep in sleep. Upon his white forehead lay one of Sam's brown hands, and the other lay softly upon his master's breast. Peace was in both their faces. Gollum looked at them. A strange expression passed over his lean, hungry face. The gleam faded from his eyes, and they went dim and gray, old and tired. A spasm of pain seemed to twist him, and he turned away, peering back up towards the pass, shaking his head, as if they engaged in some interior debate. Then he came back, and slowly putting out a trembling hand, very cautiously he touched Frodo's knee. But almost the touch was a caress. For a fleeting moment, could the sleepers have seen him, they would have thought that they beheld an old, weary hobbit, shrunken by the years that had carried him far beyond his time, beyond friends and kin, and the fields and streams of youth, an old, starved, pitiable thing. But at that touch Frodo stirred and cried out softly in his sleep, and immediately Sam was wide awake. The first thing he saw was Gollum, pawing at Master as he thought. "Hey you," he said roughly, "what are you up to?"
Nothing,
said Gollum softly.
Nice, Master.
I dare say, said Sam. But where have you been to? Sneaking off and sneaking back, you old villain? Gollum withdrew himself, and a green glint flickered under his heavy lids. Almost spider-like he looked now, crouched back on his bent limbs with his protruding eyes. The fleeting moment had passed beyond recall.
Sneaking,
he hissed.
Hobbits always so polite, yes. Oh, nice hobbits. Smeagol brings them up secret ways that nobody else could find. Tired he is. Thirsty he is. Yes, thirsty.
and he guides them up and searches for paths, and they yell, "Snake! Snake!" Very nice, friends. Oh, yes, my precious, very nice.
Sam felt a bit remorseful, though not more trustful. "Sorry," he said. "I'm sorry, but you startled me out of my sleep. And I shouldn't have been sleeping, and that made me a bit sharp. But Mr. Frodo, he's that tired. I asked him to have a wink, and well, that's how it is. Sorry, but where have you been to?"
"Sneaking,"
said Gollum, and the green glint did not leave his eyes.
"Oh, very well," said Sam. "Have it your way. I don't suppose it's so far from the truth. And now we'd better all be sneaking along together."
Sam's apology, while not eloquent, is genuine here, and it comes at a point where Gollum can still turn back on what he's about to do. Yet he allows his hatred to give way, and he chooses the evil path all on his own. It's not that Gollum wasn't helped in some way with this decision. Tolkien himself acknowledges that Sam's aggression here triggers Gollum's wrath. But though he may have been influenced, it doesn't change the fact that he still had a choice, or that Sam's conduct was even all that wrong. He's right, Gollum was indeed sneaking around. In fact, Gollum was enacting a plan Sam long suspected he had up his sleeve, without knowing any of the details. It could be argued that Sam's suspicions aren't going far enough, if anything. Sam and Faramir being guilty takes away the weight of Gollum's death on Frodo. Movie Frodo now has blame to cast for his failure to save Gollum, and it would very much make sense for him to come away with a divided conscience. But I don't really know what they're going for. The way he goes about treating Sam and Gollum while he's being manipulated is a little odd. And for one thing, it's also strange that Sam is apologizing to Gollum here and not Frodo. Depriving Gollum of his agency by treating him with injustice when it's not necessary is unbecoming of a story driven by fundamental principles like Lord of the Rings. If Gollum's innocent, basically driven to this point, then that makes Sam and Faramir into monsters. This is especially bad seeing that Gollum was, for all that the films were willing to show, changing his ways but fell back into his evil persona due to the mistreatment and trauma. These are far greater crimes than what is done to him in the books, where Faramir must enforce his laws and capture Gollum, yet does all he can not to harm him. And Sam, combined with his misgivings, lashes out at precisely the wrong moment when Gollum was undergoing the greatest internal struggle of his life. The extra bit of defense for Sam, though, is that in this context, he actually was right with his accusation. Their film counterparts, on the other hand, have their legacy tarnished. The films never recognize what they did wrong in any meaningful way. Faramir commits acts far worse than that of Boromir to please Daddy Dearest, only relenting at the last moment after he learns from his brother's example, whom he then goes on to grandstand over. Sam lets pettiness and jealousy into his heart over the smallest of genuine accomplishments by Gollum, and for both of their actions towards him, the films have nothing to say or add. The movies just roll on anyway, and no wrongdoings are recognized, at least in any way that they should be. And to pitch more fuel on the fire, the situation is not helped by the commentary tracks for these scenes in the film. Peter Jackson acts really cavalier about Gollum's torture, and I don't really know if what he's saying here is serious or not.
The interrogation scene was something that used to be quite violent, and we trimmed it right back for the theatrical release, and the DVD has a little bit more of the violence put back into it. Just a sense, a little, yeah.
Oh, God.
Just a sense that Gollum's being, what's the word? Softened up. Softened up.
Is that how you soften up people, Pete?
Oh, it's pretty nasty. I don't think it really represents the Gondorian Rangers in the best possible light.
This is a great
It even got
scene.
worse than that, because remember they used to tread on Gollum's fingers at one stage.
That's right.
To crush his fingers, which is why he sometimes has sore fingers later on towards the end of the film.
I quite like the fact that Faramir doesn't use brute force the way that Boromir does.
And Faramir's actor, David Wenham, let's just say he could use a lesson or two from his older brother.
This was referred to as the Clockwork Orange sequence. I was always worried that it was possibly a little too much violence. And I'm glad that Faramir didn't involve himself in any of the violence. I think the purists would have been totally up in arms.
You understand why I did it? The man who passes the sentence should swing the sword.
This, in my opinion, sinks Faramir to an even further low, that he would consciously stand back and watch as his dirty work was done for him. A notion that is eerily similar to a line by his father in the books. What's even more messed up is that while Denethor may have a defense and justification for this position, I really can't think of one for Faramir. He gives into evil and we're just supposed to forget all about it. If Jackson lifted up and improved Boromir for all we know him in either version, then he did the opposite with Faramir. Sam's fumblings might be forgiven, but Faramir's influence on Gollum cannot be ignored. Worse than taking errant shortcuts with writing or skipping important plot details is the seemingly intentional miscarriage of justice regarding the story's morals. I can usually find something good to say to bring everything back to a positive spin, like, hey guys, don't worry, I still like the films and such, but not here. This was a mistake. It's the only part of the films that makes me sick, and there's no defense for it. They really screwed up here. It undercuts the climax at Mount Doom, even. The third film wants to really make sure Gollum is perceived as straight-up evil, and Gandalf's words on pity and mercy are almost entirely forgotten about. The only part where this is not the case is right outside Shelob's lair. Frodo spares Gollum's life, and Gollum makes the conscious decision to heel turn on this. This, of course, is similar to what happens on the slopes of Doom in the books between Gollum and Sam, but its insertion here, so much earlier from the end of the movie, makes it less effective at carrying that moral through line. Frodo was able to understand that message by taking one look at Gollum in the books. It was Sam who needed to learn the lesson for it to be effective. Instead, here in the movies, we have Sam learning nothing, and Frodo's attempts at mercy almost lead to his destruction. His inability to find peace at the end is partially because of Faramir and Sam's best efforts at thwarting his attempt to save a tortured soul, who, for all we know, was truly innocent this time around. Congratulations! You've just listened to a man ramble and dig through the weeds regarding the faults of some 20-year-old movies, and how they relate to a 70-year-old novel. There's still more I could go on about, but I wanted to keep my points more limited to the grand scheme. I might make a video on the problems the films have that are of lesser note, but it would come with a lot of caveats and disclaimers, so much so that it might not actually be a smaller video. Overall, I'm happy with pretty much everyone's portrayal in the films, at least in part. I know I aired my complaints on Gandalf and Aragorn, but they were still really strong portrayals overall. Even with the ones that I deem aren't very good, I still have a lot of good things to say. They're not all bad, they just have strong negatives. Though there may come a time to get even more nitpicky, for now I will pass on that. I didn't want to get too far down in the weeds with this beyond what perceived faults had greater effects on the narrative, and how I might fix things. After all, this criticism comes from a love of these movies and their source material, and a desire to elevate the discourse surrounding them. Hopefully I had my facts right and had decent takes for everything. I will be highlighting any mistakes pointed out in this video in the comments, so feel free to take your shots. I welcome the critiques. I try to be as careful as I possibly could be when researching this video, but that does not mean it is without error. This is a lot of material after all. As a relevant anecdote, I once had an online argument with someone, where I was adamant that the Ringwraiths fell back on their attack on Frodo in the books near Weathertop, partly because Frodo stabbed the Witch King's foot, and made him for a time vulnerable. I don't know why I thought this, because Aragorn plainly states that the blade did no harm to the Witch King in the next scene, and later at the fjord, Frodo raises his sword only for the Witch King to shatter it with his magic. Sometimes I have strong convictions that are completely misplaced. It's embarrassing when it happens, but the best way to resolve the issue is to correct the misinformation. Tolkienism is pretty much its own field of study at this point after all, and has even been the subject of college classes, so perhaps if my video gets a proper peer review, I might be able to add a class like that to my CV someday. I really can't reiterate enough how strong my passion for these works is. I love Tolkien's contemporaries too, but I find that none of them reach quite the amount of substance as the man himself. I don't think we'll ever have another author like him. Not just one who is capable of conceiving such a legendary story and world as this, but one who also had such a gift to inspire others to create great works of their own.
Did you have any inkling that you would wind up writing the kinds of things that you have?
I read Lord of the Rings in the 60s. I kind of looked for other fantasy books at the time, but there weren't that many, especially like Tolkien.
All while apparently being a #1 dad as well. Christopher Tolkien is probably the single biggest fan of his father's work, as he made it his life's effort to edit it, critique it when necessary, and steward it until the very end to make sure it was safe for as long as possible. Yeah, the Hobbit films did happen under his watch, but they could have been worse. Not least of all, please check out Phil Dragish's Lord of the Rings audiobook and soundscape, which you may have to find in the wild online. It seems that Phil had to take any links to the soundscape down on his own website due to legal issues, but you can still head over to various places for a preview. It's not that hard to track down. It was apparently a one-man effort, which makes it all the more inspiring to me for how excellent it is. The Jackson influence on the novels really cannot be disassociated either, and I think that that's never been more true with this single fan project. Howard Shore's scores at least are synonymous with the official material, and the designs of Alan Lee and John Howe make for how I picture most of Tolkien's world, though Ted Nasmith would also be up there with them, even if he does make his hobbits look like burn victims. And I would also have to mention my personal favorite Tolkien artists, like the brothers Hildebrandt and Angus McBride, if you couldn't tell by how prominent their art was in this video. I sourced out a lot of art for this video, and while I couldn't always find the highest resolution pieces, I tried to be as diverse as possible and credit everything that I could. Please point out any errors on my part. For artists like Dennis Gordeev, it was especially hard to find names for individual pieces. If you saw your art in this video, then know that I liked it a lot, and do let me know if there's any issues with that. To everyone who has watched thus far, thank you. This was my first video that came to fruition that I felt confident enough in to publish. I just hope everyone likes it despite the subject matter. I felt it was important to discuss these issues, and I would be happy to debate the merits of any of my observations in the video. This kind of long-form content is really enjoyable to work on, but it is time-consuming. I've worked on this project for over a year in my off hours. Hopefully the next video won't take me so long. I'd like to continue to discuss film and literature with this channel, but I'd also like to branch out to video games as well. Really all forms of media are on the table. Right now I'm working on scripts for videos analyzing the Thing and Alien franchises, as well as another long-form video for Netflix's The Witcher, as a sort of post-mortem analysis on just what went wrong. That will be done when it is done, but I'm hoping to get the other videos out sooner, as they're not so vast in scope. And don't worry, this certainly won't be the last time I talk about Lord of the Rings either. Content creation has been a long-time dream of mine, and I'm just happy to finally get something out there. So again, thank you so much for watching. It really means the world to me if even just one person found this analysis worthwhile. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'd like to return with more positive Lord of the Rings content soon. I don't think I'll be able to end this without acknowledging Christopher Tolkien's comments on the Jackson movies, though. There are a few quotes which famously circle around regarding his positions on the films. All of which I'm about to reference are from a French interview with Le Monde in 2012, preceding the Hobbit movies, but they are in regard to Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings films as a whole.
They eviscerated the book, making it an action film for 15 to 25-year-olds. And it seems that The Hobbit will be of the same ilk. Tolkien has become a monster, devoured by his own popularity, and absorbed by the absurdity of our time. The chasm between the beauty and seriousness of the work, and what it has become, has gone too far for me. Such commercialization has reduced the aesthetic and philosophical impact of this creation to nothing. There is only one solution for me: turning my head away.
Within the written story, one of the more popularly perceived self-inserts for J.R.R. Tolkien, aside from Faramir, is Bilbo himself. With this in mind, it's not hard to draw similarities between Christopher and Frodo. Both committed the latter parts of their lives to chronicling the legacy of their senior, and both were not overjoyed with the understanding audiences ended up coming away with near the end of their lifetimes. If you ask me, this self-acknowledgement of the novel's own potential meta makes it age all the more gracefully. and in some ways it helps my understanding with Christopher's disappointment with the films and their reception at large. He waited a long time to say what he did, and in the end, he kept it pretty quiet, relatively speaking. While I can praise his takes on the movie before its release some years prior, and on his words regarding the Hobbit trilogy, it would be untruthful to say that I was satisfied by his statements on the Jackson trilogy. Because Christopher's words left me with want for finer critique, I started to write what began as a brief script and would eventually become this video. I will say that if anyone has the right to not be fully satisfied with the Jackson films, then it was indeed Christopher. He was the guardian of this story for much of his life, and he did a great job keeping it sacred. And while this fact helps to alleviate any misgivings I might have, I can still disagree with his sentiments on the Jackson trilogy. Unfortunately, his stewardship of the IP was not carried on in full effect by his successors, which rather hauntingly parallels the Vigil of Gondor itself, if you ask me. I just wish that after so long a stretch of silence, Christopher had articulated more than the mere criticism that the Jackson films were just action movies for young people, comparable to Harry Potter. For all we know, these were simple offhand comments on a subject he wished not to dwell on. But if this was indeed the case, and his off-the-cuff reply when prompted about these movies really was this, then my desire still stands in that I wish he had said more. With the caveat that we may not have the full picture, I think that this critique is lacking, both with respect to the movies and to the books themselves, because of the honor the films do them. It may hold up for one or two scenes, but overall the movies deliver too much to be so easily dismissed. Far more than what audiences deserve, and likely something we'll never see happen again. Thanks again for watching. If you lasted this long, then certainly you have excused my many beginner mistakes I made while producing this video, and your pardon is much appreciated. A few issues were baked in a little too soon for me to completely fix everything without delaying the publishing of this video for even longer. Know that I'll try my absolute best to crank out higher quality content in a more timely manner moving forward. For now, I'll be away working on more projects, but I'll also reply to everything I can, especially disagreement targeted towards any of my points. I welcome the discourse, and my observations wouldn't be worth much if I couldn't defend them further. I truly hope you enjoyed them. If there's more people like me out there, with the capacity to complain about something which nearly matches their ability to praise said thing, then I might be in good company. Farewell for now. And may you stay in happiness until the end of your days. Or DMCA claim you.
Forgive me. Show me again the power of the darkness, and I will let nothing stand in our way. Show me, grandfather, and I will finish what you started.